The road was already dark by the time Mara pulled her shawl tighter and told herself for the fourth time that she was not nervous. She was lying. Her hands were cold. The borrowed dress, pale green, too long at the hem, stitched with small white flowers that belonged to someone else's life, had been taken in at the waist 3 times since her neighbor Clara lent it to her, and it still did not sit right across her shoulders. She kept reaching up to adjust it. She kept stopping herself because she did not want to arrive at the claiming feast looking like a woman who spent the whole walk fighting her own clothes. The claiming feast. Even the name felt like something that happened to other people. Mara had lived in Eldon Hollow for 23 years. She knew every stone in this road. She knew the way the old bridge creaked at the 3rd plank from the left, the way the baker on Millbrook Lane put his bread out too early on cold mornings and always regretted it, the way the fog came in from the river on feast nights and sat low on the ground like it was watching. She knew all of it, and yet tonight, walking this same road she had walked her whole life, everything felt slightly sideways, slightly not hers. That was what the claiming feast did to a village. It came once a year. The Alpha King's court sent representatives, men and women of rank, alphas from outer territories, and sometimes, if the year had been quiet enough, someone from the inner court itself. They came to witness. They came to choose. Unmated women of age were presented, one by one, and the alphas present could step forward and declare a claim. If no one stepped forward, you were passed over. You went home. You came back next year, or you didn't, and either way the village remembered. Her mother had come back every year for 5 years before she stopped coming at all. Mara did not let herself think about that for more than half a second. She had a system. The system was, catalog the thought, acknowledge it, set it down on the road behind you, keep walking. She had been running this system since she was 16 and first understood what her mother's face looked like when someone asked about her father. It was a good system. It worked most of the time. She kept walking. The village center was lit with lanterns by the time she rounded the bend near the old mill. Warm light spilled from the feast hall windows, the largest building in Eldon Hollow, which was not saying much. But tonight it looked almost grand with the yellow glow cutting through the fog and the sound of voices rising and falling behind the thick wooden doors. Women in their best dresses moved toward the entrance in small groups, some of them laughing, some of them with the careful stillness of people who had decided in advance not to show anything on their faces. Mara walked alone. Not because she had no friends. She had Clara, who had lent her the dress and spent an hour that afternoon pinning Mara's dark hair up and telling her she looked beautiful, and who had meant it, and who was not eligible for the claiming because she had already bonded with a man from the eastern edge of the pack 3 years ago. She had old Owen from the market, who was 80 and called everyone girl, and pressed bread into her hands on slow days. She had the village itself, in the way you have a place that has held you even when it did not particularly see you. But you walked into the claiming alone. That was the shape of it. You went in as yourself, with only what you were, and the room decided what that was worth. Mara reached the top of the road where it curved toward the feast hall steps, and that was when she saw him. He was sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the path, the wall that marked the boundary between the old miller's land and the road. He was hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, and his coat was the color of something that had once been brown and given up on the ambition. His boots were cracked at the sole. His hair was dark and too long, and he had not shaved in what looked like several days. One hand rested open on his knee, palm up. A beggar, not common in Eldon Hollow, but not impossible. People moved through small villages all the time, especially on feast nights when there was food and light and the distraction of ceremony. They knew when to show up at the edges. Mara did not slow down. She had 1 coin in the small pocket sewn into the inside of the borrowed dress, a single copper, which was the last of what she had, until the seamstress paid her on Friday for the alterations she had finished yesterday. 1 coin. She had planned to use it for the walk home if her feet gave out and she needed to beg a cart ride from old Perrin, who charged a copper and not a penny less. She walked past the man. 3 steps past him. She stopped. She did not know why. She knew why. She did not want to admit she knew why, so she stood there on the road in the borrowed dress for a moment doing the arithmetic. 1 coin. She needed it. He needed it more visibly than she did, which was different from actually needing it more, and she was aware of that distinction, and also aware that she was standing very still on a road in front of the claiming feast, doing philosophy instead of walking. She turned around. He had not looked up. She walked back to the wall and held the coin out. The copper caught the lantern light for a moment. Small, dull, not worth much in any real calculation. He looked up then, and she caught a glimpse of his face before she looked away in the particular way you look away when you're trying not to stare at someone you've just given charity to, because staring makes it something else. Dark eyes. a stillness to his expression that was not what she expected from a man sitting in the cold with his palm out. She did not examine that thought. "Here," she said, just the one word. Then she walked on. She did not look back. The feast hall steps were crowded with the last arrivals, women adjusting their dresses and men from the outer territories arriving in groups of 2 and 3, wearing their rank sashes and the particular confidence of people who knew that tonight was designed to go well for them. Mara moved through the crowd and into the warmth of the hall, and she felt the coin's absence in her pocket with every step, like a missing tooth you keep finding with your tongue. She told herself it was fine. She would walk home. Her feet had survived worse. The inside of the feast hall was louder than she remembered from last year. There were more people this time. She could see alphas from at least 2 outer territories, and the inner court representative had brought 3 attendants instead of the usual one, which meant something in the political language of these events that Mara did not have enough context to read. The long tables were already heavy with food, candles everywhere. The head elder, a man named Harwick who had been running these ceremonies for longer than most people could remember, stood near the raised platform at the far end of the hall with his assistant and the ceremony ledger. Mara found a position near the serving table on the right side of the room. The serving table was the best place to stand at an event like this. It gave your hands something to do. You could reach for a cup, or straighten a napkin, or simply rest your fingers on the edge of the wood and look like a woman who had chosen to be where she was standing, rather than a woman who had drifted to the edges because the center of the room felt like standing in the middle of a field during a storm. Both things could be true simultaneously. The serving table allowed for the ambiguity. She took a cup of something warm and sweet-smelling and held it with both hands. The room filled up quickly. She recognized most of the village faces, though some of the women had done things to their hair that made them briefly strange. Clara's cousin Nina, with her dark curls pinned up in a way that added 3 inches of height. The miller's daughter Petra, with her usual braid, traded for something softer and more deliberate. They were all doing what Mara was doing. They were all wearing their best version of themselves and hoping it was enough, and trying very hard not to look like they were hoping, because hope in a room like this was the most exposed thing you could carry. The outer territory alphas moved through the room in the way of men who had done this before, measuring the space, noting the faces, keeping their own faces pleasant and uninformative. 2 of them were older, heavy-shouldered men with the look of people who ran large territories and found these events a formality. One was young, barely older than Mara, with red hair and a nervous energy he tried to cover by standing very straight. He was not doing a terrible job. Mara was watching the red-haired young alpha try to look comfortable when someone stopped at the serving table beside her. She registered him peripherally at first, just another body in a room full of bodies, reaching for the bread. Then something made her look directly. She could not have said what. The absence of noise around him, maybe. The way he moved through the space without the particular quality that the other alphas had. The one that said, "Look at me," without ever actually saying it. He was not wearing a rank sash. That was the first thing that struck her properly. He was dressed in plain dark wool, the kind that was well made enough to hold its shape but carried no marker of status. No colored thread at the collar, no embroidery at the cuffs. His coat was slightly travel-worn. He was tall. She noticed that only because the edge of his shoulder was level with her eye line in a way that required her to look up slightly, and she was not a short woman. He had dark hair, and she did not look at his face long enough to catalog it, because she was already looking back at her cup. He reached past her for the bread, not rudely, just reaching, the way you reach for something when you're hungry and there is food nearby and no particular reason to be ceremonious about it. His sleeve brushed the edge of the serving table, 2 inches from her arm. She felt the proximity of it with a sharpness that annoyed her. She moved her cup to her other hand. He broke off a piece of the bread and ate it standing there, which was not how men of rank usually behaved at these events, but he did it with such complete indifference to the fact that it did not read as bad manners. It read as someone who was simply hungry. She looked at his face then, because she had been not looking at it in a way that was becoming its own kind of looking, and it was easier to just do the thing. He was looking at her. Not in the way that some of the alphas were looking at the women in the room, that particular kind of appraisal that had nothing unkind in it but nothing personal either. He was looking at her the way you look at someone when you've recognized something and you're deciding what to do with the recognition. It was a look she could not immediately categorize, and that bothered her, because she was generally good at categorizing things. Something moved through his expression, quiet, specific, like a word said in a room where you didn't expect anyone to be speaking the language. She held his gaze for 1 beat, 2 beats. He looked away first. He took his bread and walked back toward the wall, not the center of the room, not toward the other alphas, but the wall, where the candles were fewer and the shadow was more, and he stood there and ate his bread with the air of a man who had found the only comfortable chair in a room full of uncomfortable ones, and was not going to explain this to anyone. Mara turned back to her cup. Her heart was doing something unhelpful. She addressed it internally and firmly, and it did not stop, but it did quiet down to a manageable level. She did not look at him again for a full 20 minutes, which required more effort than she would have liked to admit. The ceremony began at 7:30, when Elder Harwick climbed to the platform and called the room to attention with the particular kind of throat clearing that carried authority without raising its voice. The alphas arranged themselves along the right side of the room. The women eligible for claiming stood on the left. Mara moved into the line and found her place near the back of it. The lineup was loosely organized by bloodline status, highest to lowest, and Mara's bloodline was what it was. She looked at the back of Nina's head ahead of her. Nina had nice posture. It was something to look at. The first girl called forward was Petra, the miller's daughter. She walked to the center of the room with her chin up and her hands clasped in front of her, and she stood there while the room looked at her. And after a moment, one of the heavy-shouldered outer territory alphas stepped forward and inclined his head. Claimed. Petra's expression did not change, but something around her eyes did. A loosening. She walked to stand beside the man who had chosen her, and the ceremony moved on. The next two were claimed quickly. The fourth was passed over in the particular silence that felt like a sound. The girl, Mara did not know her name, she was from one of the outer farms, walked back to the women's side of the room with her face very still, and stood there looking at the wall. Mara watched her, and felt something in her chest that was too complicated to name quickly. The line moved. Nina was claimed by the red-haired young alpha, which made both of them look surprised, and then quickly not surprised, and for a moment, something very real passed between them in the center of the room. Before they remembered where they were, the room noticed. Even Elder Harwick seemed faintly moved, though he covered it with procedure. Mara counted the women still ahead of her. 3, then 2, then 1. Then it was her. Harwick called her name, her full name, Mara Else Weston, her mother's name before her mother stopped using it, and she walked to the center of the room. She looked straight forward. The wall at the far end of the hall had a water stain in the plaster, shaped vaguely like a running hair. She found the hair and looked at it steadily. The floor was stone and cold even through her shoes. The borrowed dress was still too long at the hem. The room was quiet. She had told herself it would be fine either way. She had run this particular reassurance through her system very carefully in the days leading up to tonight, had looked at it from multiple angles, had made genuine peace with both outcomes. She believed that she believed it. She was standing in the center of the room with 20 pairs of eyes on her, and she was discovering that peace, made in a quiet bedroom, did not always travel. 5 seconds. 10. 15. She was counting. She should not have been counting. And then, movement. Not from the line of alphas on the right, from the wall. The man in the dark wool coat stepped out of the shadow and walked into the center of the room. He walked with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who had decided something and was not interested in the drama of it, and he stopped when he was 3 feet from Mara and turned to face Elder Harwick. The room did something Mara had never heard a room do before. It went silent in layers. The shuffling first, then the murmuring, then even the small sounds. The clink of cups set down, the brush of fabric. It went silent from the edges inward, like a pond going still after a stone. Harwick's face went through several expressions very quickly. He was a man who prided himself on composure, and you could see him exercise it now with both hands. He looked at the man. He looked at the seal on the inside of the man's coat, which had apparently become visible in the movement. His expression arrived somewhere between reverence and something that might have been slight panic. "My lord," he said. His voice was careful. Careful in the way of someone walking a bridge they suddenly cannot trust. The man said Mara's name. Not her full name, not the formal recitation, just Mara. The way you say the name of someone you have already decided is a person and not a formality. Harwick made a sound. He recovered. He stood very straight and he announced, in the voice trained by decades of ceremony, that Alpha King Callum Dre of the Northern Territory had declared a claim. The hall broke open. Not loudly, not with shouting. These were people trained by social habit to contain themselves in formal spaces. But the quality of silence changed completely. It went from ceremony to shock. And shock is a specific kind of sound even when it makes no noise. She could feel it on her skin. She could feel the moment when the room reorganized itself around a new reality, the way water reorganizes around a dropped stone. She was still standing in the center of the floor. She looked at the man, at Callum, and he looked back at her, and his face was not the face of a king who had just performed a power, which was what she might have expected if she had expected any of this at all. His face was the face of someone who had come here knowing what he was going to do, and had done it, and was now simply standing in the aftermath of it, the way you stand in a room after you've opened a window, waiting to see what the air does. Her mind went to the road, the wall, the cracked boots, the palm-up hand, the coin she could not afford, the coin she gave anyway, because the math said no, and she went anyway, because she had always gone anyway, her entire life, because saying yes past the math was the only thing that had ever actually gotten her anywhere. He had been on that wall. He had sat there in a coat that cost nothing, and boots that were falling apart, and his palm open, and his face still, and she had given him her last coin and looked away and walked on, and she had not thought for a single moment about what he might be, because it had not been relevant to what he was. A person, in the cold, hand out. That was what she had seen. That was what she had responded to. She stood in the center of the floor of the claiming feast and understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that her life had just changed shape in a way that had nothing to do with the feast, or the dress, or the ceremony, or any of the things she had spent 3 days preparing for. She had changed her life's shape last Thursday at the side of a road with a coin she could not spare. Callum was still looking at her. She did not look away. She was cold in the borrowed dress, and her feet were tired from the walk, and the coin was gone from her pocket, and she was going to have to walk home, or she was going to have to figure out what happened next, which turned out to be the same thing. She lifted her chin, just slightly. The hall held its breath. She stepped forward 1 step to close the 3 feet between them, and the hall breathed again. Elder Harwick began the formal acknowledgement in a voice that only shook once, briefly, on the 3rd word. Outside, the fog sat low on the road where Mara had walked. The stone wall was empty. The lanterns burned. The feast night had done what feast nights did. It had taken someone's ordinary life and turned it on its side. And the road did not care, and the fog did not care, and the borrowed dress with the white flowers that belonged to someone else's story was already, in ways that Mara had not yet felt the full weight of, becoming hers. She had given away her last coin. She had not known what she was doing. She had not needed to. She had stood at the edge of the math, looked at a man in the cold, and done the human thing. The rest was already in motion. Nobody in Eldon Hollow slept that night. Mara knew this because she could not sleep either, and at 3 in the morning she got up from the narrow bed in the guest room they had put her in at the feast hall's adjoining house, and stood at the window and looked out at the village she had lived in for 23 years, and could see, in 4 separate windows across the lane, the flicker of candles where people were awake talking about what had happened. She was what had happened. That was strange. She had spent her entire life being the girl at the edge of things, the seamstress's daughter, the one with the unremarkable bloodline, the one who turned up at events and was noted and forgotten with equal thoroughness. She had been the background of other people's stories for so long that she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the hum of something that has always been there. Tonight she was the center of it. She stood at the window in the dark and took careful stock of herself, the way her mother had taught her to do when things shifted. Not what she felt, that was too large and too many-sided to look at directly, but what she knew, what the actual facts were, stripped of the noise. Fact. The man in the dark coat was the Alpha King of the Northern Territory. Fact. He had sat on a road wall in disguise and she had given him a coin. Fact. He had walked out of the shadow and said her name. Fact. She had stepped forward. She went back over those 4 facts 3 times. They did not change. They did not resolve into something simpler or more comfortable. They sat there in the dark, being exactly what they were. She went back to bed and did not sleep and waited for morning. Morning came in the way of northern autumn mornings. Gray first, then a gradual gathering of light that never quite committed. There was a knock at the door at 6:30. A young woman in the formal vest of court attendant stood in the hallway with a tray of breakfast things and a sealed note, and an expression of careful neutrality that told Mara she had been briefed on the situation, and was professionally determined not to have opinions about it. "From the Alpha King's party, miss," she said. Her name turned out to be Fiona. She had freckles and the kind of posture that came from being told to stand straight so many times it became automatic. Mara took the tray and the note. The note was brief. It said that the formal proceedings for a declared claim required her consent to be given in front of a witness by the following evening, and that King Callum would make himself available at whatever hour she wished to speak with him, and that she was under no obligation of any kind until that consent was formally given. The handwriting was very plain, no flourishes. She read it twice. She set it on the windowsill and ate the breakfast, which was good. proper bread with butter that had not been stretched thin, and an apple that was cold and sharp-tasting. Small comforts were still comforts. She had always been good at locating them. Fiona reappeared an hour later to take the tray, and said that the king's party was at the Eastern Inn, and that King Callum had asked if Mara would like to walk with him that morning, if she was willing, and that she should feel no pressure either way. Mara looked at Fiona. Fiona looked at a point slightly above Mara's head. "Tell him yes," Mara said. She put on her own clothes, her actual clothes, the plain skirt and the good wool top she had worn for 3 years and knew the weight of, and she wrapped herself in her own shawl, which was not as fine as the borrowed dress but was hers, and she went downstairs. Callum was waiting at the foot of the steps outside. He was wearing the dark wool again. Still no sash, still no visible mark of rank. He looked like a man who had come to walk through a village on a gray morning, which was exactly what he was, and somehow that simplicity made him harder to look at, not easier. She had the strange feeling of looking at someone slightly more solid than the space around him. She came down the steps. They stood on the same level. She was looking straight at him. "I thought you might want to see a face that isn't performing," he said. His voice was low, even, with a slight northern roughness to it. "You could have told me who you were," she said. "Yes. Why didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because then you'd have given me the coin differently." She thought about that. She had been thinking about it since 3 in the morning, actually, from slightly different angles. This was a new angle. She turned it over. He was right, which was irritating, and also interesting, because it told her something specific about how his mind worked, that he had thought through the difference between a coin given freely and a coin given to a king, and had wanted the first one. "That's a complicated reason," she said. "It's a simple reason," he said. The complication is in the question it was answering. They walked. The village was quiet at this hour, which was different from the night before. The feast night magic had lifted, and Eldon Hollow was just Eldon Hollow again, smoke from chimneys, the distant sound of the miller's machinery, a dog moving with purpose across the lane near the baker's. Mara knew every sound of it. She noticed that Callum walked without looking at buildings, which was what visitors usually did. He looked at the ground, at the horizon, occasionally at her. "You were there the whole time," she said. "At the feast." "Yes. Near the serving table. You were near the serving table. I came to see what was near the serving table." She stopped walking. He stopped a pace ahead and turned. "You identified me on the road," she said. It was not quite a question. "I identified you on the road." She looked at him. He did not look away, did not fill the silence with explanation. She appreciated that, actually, more than she expected to. Men who filled silence with explanation usually filled it with the wrong things. "What did you see?" she said. "That I didn't know you were seeing." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone arranging a story, the quiet of someone being exact. "Someone who was dressed for the most important night of the year in her village," he said, walking alone, and stopping. "Plenty of people stop for beggars. At the claiming feast, with their last coin." He paused. "I could see it was the last one. You held it for a moment before you gave it, not hesitation, calculation. Then you gave it anyway." She started walking again. He fell into step beside her. She did not like how well he had read that moment. She did not like it in the specific way you don't like being understood by someone you haven't decided to trust yet, because it puts you at an uneven balance and you haven't agreed to the terms. "It was 1 coin, she said. "Yes," he said. They walked past the old bridge. She stepped over the 3rd plank from the left automatically. He noticed her step and looked at the plank but did not ask. "How long have you been doing this?" she said. "The disguise." 3 years. "And before last night, I walked away from all of them." She absorbed that. 3 years of feast nights. 3 years of sitting on a wall in broken boots and watching who stopped and who didn't. She did not know how to feel about being the one who stopped. It felt both ordinary and terrifying. Ordinary because she had simply done what she did, and terrifying because apparently doing what she did had consequences that now included the Alpha King of the Northern Territory walking beside her on a gray morning in Eldon Hollow, asking her to consent to a claim. "You're going to need my answer by this evening," she said. "I'll need a formal answer by this evening. You can give me any answer you want right now and it won't be binding." She stopped again. He was, she noticed, very good at stopping when she stopped, which was the kind of thing that seemed small and turned out not to be. "Tell me what you need," she said. "Not what the court needs, not what the claim requires. What you actually need." He looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was measuring, she held still for it. "Someone," he said, "who does the math and goes anyway." She did not say anything. The dog from near the baker's had followed them at a distance and was now sitting on the road about 20 feet back, watching them with the mild interest of a creature that has nothing else scheduled. Mara looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. "I need to think," she said. "I know. I need to talk to someone. Yes. And I need to understand what saying yes actually means," she said. "Not in ceremony terms. In real terms. What my life looks like." He nodded. "I can tell you that. Not right now," she said. "This afternoon. Give me the morning." He agreed to this without any visible difficulty, which was another thing she noted and filed away. Men who could agree to wait without performing the act of waiting were rare and worth marking. She left him at the corner of the mill road and went to find Clara. Clara opened the door before Mara knocked, which meant she had been watching from the window, which meant she had been awake all night too. "Come in," Clara said. "I've already made tea 3 times because I didn't know what else to do with my hands." Mara sat at Clara's kitchen table, which had a crack in the center from when Clara's youngest dropped a heavy pot on it 3 winters ago, and she told Clara everything from the beginning: the coin, the road, the serving table, the man in the dark wool, the way he had looked at her, the way the room had gone silent, the note, the walk. Clara listened with her hands around her cup and her face doing a complicated series of things. When Mara finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to go?" Clara said. Not, "Should you go?" Not, "What an opportunity?" Not, "Your mother would be so proud." Just, "Do you want to?" Mara loved Clara very much in that moment. "I don't know yet," Mara said. "But I think the honest answer is getting closer to yes, and that frightens me." "Why does it frighten you?" "Because it's enormous, and I might fail at it." "You failed at anything before?" Mara opened her mouth. Closed it. "Things didn't always work," she said. "The market stall in the spring. The alterations I took on for the West Village when I didn't know their sizing yet. That's different from failing," Clara said. "That's learning." Mara looked at her cup. The tea was strong and slightly too bitter, the way Clara always made it, which was the way Mara had come to associate with conversations that were honest. "What if he realizes I'm ordinary?" Mara said. Clara put down her cup. "Mara," she said. "He sat on a wall in broken boots for 3 years watching people walk past him in their best clothes. He knows ordinary. He chose you specifically." Mara sat with that for a while. She thought about her mother's 20 years of not being chosen. She thought about the water stain shaped like a hair. She thought about the coin, the weight of it in her palm before she let it go. The specific arithmetic of that moment, the way the numbers had said no and she had gone anyway, and how that had always been the way she moved through the world, past the math and into the thing itself. She thought about Callum standing at the bottom of the steps in dark wool with no sash, looking like a man who had come on ordinary business, and the specific quality of his stillness, and the word he had used, someone who does the math and goes anyway. He had named the thing that she had never been able to name cleanly. "I'm going to say yes," she said. Clara inhaled once, sharply, then let it go slowly. Her eyes were bright. She did not make it about herself, which was why Mara had come to her first. "Then go say it," Clara said. Mara walked back through the village. The morning had brightened by now, the gray lifting into something closer to silver, and the smoke from chimneys had shifted from winter morning thick to the lighter drift of households getting on with their day. She walked past the old bridge and the baker's and the narrow lane that ran behind the mill, and she noticed all of it in the way you notice things when you know you are walking through them, for one of the last times before the version of your life they belong to becomes the version that used to be true. Fiona was waiting outside the Eastern Inn. "He's in the front room," she said, and held the door. The front room of the Eastern Inn was low-ceilinged and smelled of wood smoke and something cooking. 2 of Callum's attendants sat at the far end of the room doing something with papers. Callum was at the window, standing with a cup and looking out at the village lane. He turned when she came in. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Not formal. Not ceremony. Just the word." He set down the cup. "There are things I need to tell you," he said, "about what you're walking into. The court. The politics. People who will not be glad about this." "I know," she said. "You don't yet," he said, and not unkindly. "But you will." "Tell me," she said. He did. He talked for a long time, standing at the window of the inn in Eldon Hollow, and she listened the way she had learned to listen, not for the comfortable parts, but for the shape of the whole thing. She listened for what he did not smooth over, for the places where he let the difficulty be difficult without trying to make it smaller. He told her about the council, about the senior advisors who had expected him to claim someone from a lineage that would strengthen trade agreements, about the eastern border disputes that had made the last 2 years politically unstable, about the 3 men on his council who would see her as a problem to be managed. He told her all of it. He did not apologize for any of it. That told her more than the words. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me this on purpose," she said. "Yes. Because you want to see if I walk out." "Because you deserve to walk out if you want to," he said. "And because I'm tired of being in rooms where people are not saying what they actually know." She thought of the serving table at the feast hall, the safe edges of rooms, the cataloging system she had been running since she was 16. The way she had spent her entire life learning to survive in spaces that were not quite designed for her, learning to navigate situations where most of the information was withheld from her, learning to do the math in the dark and still find the thing she was looking for. "I'm not walking out," she said. He nodded. "The formal consent," he said, "is at 5 this evening." "I know. It will make things real." "Things are already real," she said. "They got real on a road with a coin. The paperwork is just the paperwork." Something shifted in his face. Small, brief. She did not have enough knowledge of him yet to read it with accuracy, but it felt like the expression of a man who has been bracing for something for a long time and has just, quietly, been able to stop. She went back to the guest room and packed her things, which did not take long because she had not brought much. She sat on the bed and wrote a letter to her mother, which took longer, not because she had too much to say, but because she had to be very careful about the words. Her mother had her own long relationship with Hope, and Mara did not want to hand her something she could not hold. She wrote it twice and sealed the second one. At 4:30 she put on the borrowed dress. Clara had arrived to help her, and had brought a shawl of her own, deep blue, much finer than anything Mara owned, and pressed it into Mara's hands without saying anything, because Clara understood the specific poetry of a woman needing something of her own in a moment that was about to belong to everyone else. Mara pinned her hair herself. Simple. She did not want anything that was not her. At 5 she walked into the room where Elder Harwick waited with his ledger and his witness, and Callum stood on the other side of the table, and she gave her consent in the words the ceremony required, and Harwick wrote it down in the ledger and the witness signed, and it was done. She was claimed. Not taken, not won, not processed. Claimed. The word, in the original language the Pax had used for 300 years, meant recognized and bound, and those two things in that order, because the recognition came first. Callum had recognized her on a road. She had recognized herself in the act of giving the coin, though she had not known that was what she was doing at the time. You rarely did. That evening, at the small supper the inn put on for the departing party, Mara sat at the table and ate well and spoke to Fiona about the journey north and whether the road was better than it used to be, and she watched Callum across the table talk to one of his attendants about something she couldn't hear, and she thought, this is the beginning. Not the feast, not the drama of the center of the room. This, the ordinary supper, the road talk, the firelight that was just firelight. She had been right about one thing. She was going to walk home. Just not the way she had planned. She was walking north. The coin was gone. She was still going. The Northern Territory began before you saw it. It began in the quality of the air, a coldness that was different from the cold of Eldon Hollow, cleaner and more serious, carrying the smell of pine forests and high ground. It began in the way the road changed from the packed earth lanes of the south to the dark stone causeways that had been laid down 2 centuries ago by the first Northern Pack, and maintained ever since, each stone fitted tightly to the next with the precision of people who took the long view. It began in the way the light fell differently up here, lower and more level, as if the sun were taking a more honest angle at things. They had been traveling for 3 days. Mara had spent the first day managing what her face was doing, which was the primary labor of the first day. She was sitting in a covered coach with Fiona and another attendant named Gwen, small, quiet, with quick eyes and the habit of noting everything. And she was trying to appear like a woman who had traveled in covered coaches before, which she had not. The road was smoother than she feared. The coach was better sprung than she expected. She spent a lot of the first morning looking out the window at passing countryside, and locating things that were interesting to look at so that she would not look like a person finding things interesting to look at for the first time. Callum rode outside. He rode a gray horse with the look of an animal that had done hard miles and was not troubled by them. She saw him through the coach window sometimes, just the edge of his shape passing the frame, or the back of his coat when he slowed to speak with one of the outriders. He did not come into the coach. She was not sure whether she was relieved or something else. Fiona turned out to be a talker, once you got past the professional silence of the first hour. She was from a village 2 days north of the capital, had been in court service for 4 years, had 3 younger sisters she described, with the specific exhaustion of someone who loved them enormously, and found them relentless. She told Mara things about the northern court in the way of someone giving you a map before a journey, not because you'd asked for it, but because she could see you would need it. Lady Sarah, Fiona said, on the afternoon of the second day, with the care of someone choosing a heavy thing to put down gently, is the head of the territorial council. She has been in that position for 11 years. She is very accomplished. And, Mara said, and she had identified 3 possible candidates for the king's claim this year, from territorial families with significant landholding and long bloodlines. And I am not any of those. No, said Fiona. You are not. What will she do? Fiona looked at the window for a moment. She will be very polite, she said. She is always very polite. Mara heard what was not said in that sentence and stored it alongside everything else she was collecting. The picture was assembling itself, piece by piece, the way the picture always did when you paid attention. She had been paying attention to things her whole life that other people thought weren't worth noting. On the 3rd morning, Callum came into the coach at the last change of horses and sat across from her, and Fiona and Gwen found reasons to be elsewhere, which spoke well of their instincts. We'll be there by midday, he said. What do I need to know that you haven't told me yet? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. The palace is larger than it reads from outside, he said. The east wing is older than the rest of the building, and the corridors don't follow the same logic. You'll get lost the first week. Everyone does. That's not what I'm asking. I know, he said. I'm giving you the practical things first, because the political things require more from you to hold, and I want to start with something you can carry easily. She looked at him. He was very direct, which she had noticed and kept noticing because it was unusual. Most people spent a great deal of energy managing the angle at which they delivered information. He just delivered it. Go on then, she said. The council, he explained, was 7 members. 4 would accept her without pleasure but without active opposition. They were pragmatists who would wait to see what she did before deciding what she was. Lady Sarah, who led the council, would not oppose her in any way that was visible or actionable. She was far too experienced for that. But she would apply every legal and procedural tool available to her to test whether the claim was valid in the ways the old pack laws required. This was not personal, he said. Sarah did the same thing to everything that was not exactly what she had planned for. She's not your enemy, he said. She's a woman who has spent 11 years making a careful plan for the future of the Northern Territory, and you are not in that plan, and she is going to have to rebuild the plan around you, and she will not thank you for the inconvenience. And the other 2 council members, Mara said. Lord Aldrich, he said, is 70 years old, has been on the council for 30 of them, and does not accept change in any form. He is predictable, which is useful. He'll vote against everything for the first 2 years and then quietly align himself with whatever appears to be winning. And the 7th? Something moved across Callum's face, slight. Edmund Vane, he is 29. He represents the eastern border packs. He is intelligent and he has his own ambitions, which he has never directly stated, which is how I know they're significant. She watched him. There was more to that one. She left it. What do I actually do? She said. Day to day, when we arrive. You meet people, he said. You learn the palace. You attend council sessions as an observer, not as a participant, not yet. You are formally introduced to the pack elders from each territory. He paused. And you survive Lady Sarah's welcome. Is it that memorable? It is courteous, thorough, and designed to make you feel precisely measured, and found to be approximately adequate, he said. Mara almost smiled. He said it so flatly. I have been found approximately adequate by people my whole life, she said. I've made a reasonable peace with it. He looked at her for a moment. That's what you think is happening, he said. Sarah is better than that. You won't feel measured. You'll feel welcomed. You'll only understand later that the welcome was also an assessment. She considered that. It was a more complicated warning than she had expected from him, and she revised upward, slightly, her estimate of what they were walking into. The coach stopped at a checkpoint midday, and she leaned out the window, and that was when she saw the Northern Palace for the first time. It was large in the way that things built over several centuries tend to be large, not in one grand statement but in the accumulation of additions, each generation adding its wing or its tower, so that the whole thing read as a record of time rather than a single intention. The stone was dark gray, almost black in the midday light, and the towers at the western end were the oldest part, rounded and thick-walled. The newer east wing was more angular, A high outer wall ran the entire perimeter, and through the main gate she could see a wide courtyard with a flagged floor and a bare tree at the center that looked very old and very sure of its right to be exactly where it was. "It's serious," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." They went through the gate. The courtyard was staffed, guards at the posts, a groom moving to take the horses, attendants appearing from various doors, and at the top of the steps to the main entrance, a woman who could only be Lady Sarah. Mara had not been given a physical description. She did not need one. Sarah was in her early 50s, and had the look of someone who had spent decades standing in exactly the place she intended to stand. She was slender, precisely dressed in the dark colors of the council, with silver hair pulled back in a way that had nothing ornamental in it. She stood at the top of the steps with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face in an expression that said, "Welcome. Come in. The house is ready for you." And underneath it, not readable unless you were looking for it specifically, the expression said, "I have assessed the situation. I have assessed you. I am deciding what this means." Mara descended from the coach. She stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Sarah. Sarah looked down at her. This happened for one beat, which was all it needed. Then Sarah came down the steps and said something gracious about the journey and the weather and the arrangements she had made for Mara's rooms, and the welcome was warm and complete, and not a word of it was false, and not a word of it was entirely what it appeared to be, and Mara understood, with a cold clarity, what Callum had meant. She smiled and said the right things and followed Sarah into the palace. The palace interior was warmer than outside, and smelled of beeswax and pine, and something else underneath. Stone, old wood, the specific smell of a building that has been occupied continuously for a very long time. The corridors were wide enough for 4 people walking abreast. The ceilings in the entrance hall were vaulted, with carved bosses at the intersections of the stone ribs, and Mara looked at them for 1 second as she passed, because they were extraordinary, and she allowed herself that 1 second, and then she looked straight ahead. Fiona materialized at her shoulder, which she was grateful for. "Your rooms are in the south wing," Fiona said quietly. "3rd floor. The windows look over the kitchen garden and the hill beyond." "What's in the east wing?" Mara said, also quietly. "The council chambers. The archives. Lord Aldrich's office. And Edmund Vane." A small pause. "He has rooms in the east wing as well, yes." Mara made note. Her rooms were 3 connected chambers, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a dressing room that was larger than the entire bedroom she had grown up in. Everything was clean and well appointed and clearly prepared with care, which meant that Sarah had directed this personally, or someone who reported to Sarah had, and either way it communicated something. "We have made ready for you. This is what we do with guests." Guest. Not queen in progress, not the king's claimed. Guest. She set her bag on the dressing room floor and stood in the center of the sitting room and took a slow breath. Fiona was waiting in the doorway. "Tell me the names," Mara said. "Everyone I will meet in the next 48 hours. Everyone who matters, and everyone who appears not to but does." Fiona looked slightly surprised. Then she smiled. Small, real. "Yes," she said. "All right." They sat down and Fiona talked for 2 hours, and Mara listened and asked questions and built the map of the place in her head the way she had always built maps, by the people, not the geography. Geography was just where people kept their arguments. Dinner was formal. Not the most formal Mara would later learn the palace was capable of, but formal enough. 12 people at the long table in the smaller dining room, Callum at the head, Sarah at his right, a collection of senior council members and their partners, and 2 territorial lords who happened to be visiting, and now found themselves at the most interesting dinner of their year. Mara sat 3 seats from Callum on the left side, not beside him. That was a deliberate seating choice, she understood immediately, giving her space to find her feet before the proximity became politically loaded. She was grateful for the thought, and slightly irritated that she needed it. Lord Aldrich was across the table from her. He was indeed 70, and had the face of a man who had outlasted several sets of other people's plans, and was comfortable with this. He looked at her once, directly, then went back to his wine, and she had the sense that he had placed her in a category, and the category was, not yet knowable, therefore not yet relevant. She could work with that. Edmund Vane was at the far end of the table. He was younger than the room, which she had known. He was also watching her in a way that was too careful to be obvious and not careful enough to be invisible. He caught her looking at him looking at her, and he smiled, quick, socially perfect, and turned to the person beside him. She turned to Fiona, who was seated beside her by design. "Edmund Vane smiled at me," she said quietly. "He smiles at everyone," Fiona said, equally quietly. When it benefits him, they ate. The food was good in the northern style, heavy, warming, the kind of food that made sense in a cold country. She ate properly, not nervously. She had eaten difficult meals before, at tables where she was not quite welcome, at events where the fact of her presence was a slightly awkward thing that everyone was too polite to acknowledge. She had learned that eating well at a difficult table was one of the most powerful statements you could make without speaking. She ate well. Sarah spoke to her twice across the table, once about the journey from Eldon Hollow, which Mara answered accurately and without complaint, and once about the seasonal weather in the southern villages, which she answered with a warmth that was genuine, because the question, oddly, was genuine. She had not expected Sarah to be genuinely curious about anything, and this revised something. After dinner, the group moved to the reception room, and Callum found a moment to stand beside her near the fireplace, while the room arranged itself into the smaller conversations of after-dinner life. "How are you doing?" he said. It was quiet enough to be private. "I'm doing," she said. "Sarah seated you 3 down from me." "I know. It was a kindness, even if that wasn't the only reason." He looked at her with a slight expression of assessment. "You caught that quickly." "She's very good," Mara said. "I'd be stupid not to notice. Most people spend the first month not noticing. I don't have a month to not notice." He was quiet for a moment. The fire was warm at her left side. Someone across the room laughed at something, one of the territorial lords, a full and genuine sound. The room had settled into itself. It no longer had the quality of performance that the dinner had carried. "Edmund Vane smiled at me," she said. Callum did not look toward Vane's end of the room. He smiles at everything new, until he decides whether it's useful. And then? Then he smiles more specifically. "Has he decided about me yet?" "He's still watching," Callum said. "That's the most information you'll get tonight." She looked at the fire. "I got lost," she said, "coming back from my rooms to the dining room. I ended up in a corridor near the kitchens and a cook's assistant had to walk me back." "Everyone does," he said. "You told me that." "I did." "It's good that you told me," she said, "because when I was standing in the wrong corridor I thought, he warned me about this. And it helped." Something crossed his face again. That quiet, specific movement that she had first seen at the serving table in Eldon Hollow. She was getting better at reading its outline even if she couldn't yet read its contents. "I'll have someone draw you a map," he said. "I'll draw my own," she said. "I learn faster that way." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I believe you would." She went to bed that night in the large room with the windows that looked over the kitchen garden, and she lay in the dark and listened to a building that made sounds she did not know yet, the particular creak of old stones settling in the cold, the distant sound of a guard's footstep on the outer wall, the wind coming off the hill. Every building had a language. She would learn this one. She thought about Sarah and the warmth that was genuine, and the warmth that was assessment, and about Edmund Vane's well-timed smile, and about Lord Aldrich who had placed her in the not-yet-relevant category, and about the territorial lords who had eaten their dinner without particular interest in her, and about Fiona beside her at the table with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had decided, without ceremony, to be useful. She thought about Callum near the fireplace saying, "I believe you would." She thought about Clara's kitchen table and the bitter tea, and "Do you want to go?" She thought about her mother's letter, unsealed in her bag, which she would send in the morning. She was in the Northern Palace. She had walked here from a coin. The stone walls around her were 200 years old, and the wind was cold, and the room was dark, and she was more awake than she had been in years, every sense at its highest setting, alive in the specific way that things are alive when they matter. She had not failed yet. She also had not succeeded yet. She had arrived. That, she decided, was enough for the first night. She slept before she expected to. The map of the palace took Mara 4 days to draw properly. She did it on a sheet of paper she asked Fiona for on the second morning, using a pencil from the small writing desk in the sitting room, walking the corridors herself in the hours before the palace came fully alive. She was up before 6 every day, habit from years of early morning alterations work, when the light was best and the house quiet, and she used those hours to walk. She got lost twice more. She added the wrong turns to the map in red. By the 5th day, she did not get lost. The palace was beginning to have the feeling of a place she occupied rather than a place she was visiting, which was a different feeling and she recognized it. It was the same feeling that happened in any new room after enough intentional time inside it. The walls stop belonging to the room and start belonging to you. She had always been good at this. Her mother had called it settling, and had meant it as a positive thing, and had been right. She attended her first council session as an observer on the 6th day. The council chamber was in the east wing, as Fiona had said, a high-ceilinged room with a long table and 7 chairs, and a single chair set slightly apart, which was hers. She sat in the separate chair, and she did not speak, and she watched. She watched Sarah run the meeting with the precision of someone who had done it so many times that the structure had become invisible, which was the highest level of skill. The agenda moved without apparent effort. Arguments were acknowledged and redirected before they became arguments. Lord Aldrich grumbled twice and was gentled with a phrase that agreed with him while declining his position entirely, and he accepted this and moved on, which told Mara everything she needed to know about how Sarah managed him and therefore something important about the entire council's internal weather. Edmund Vane spoke twice. Both times he said the right thing. Both times the right thing was also the thing that made him look most capable in the room. Callum chaired the session with the same plainness she had noticed in everything else he did. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, it landed without requiring repetition. After the session, walking back through the east wing toward the south, she passed Aldrich in the corridor. He stopped and looked at her with the expression of someone who has made a decision. "You were watching Sarah," he said. "Yes," Mara said. "Most people watch the king." "The king was watching Sarah too," she said. Aldrich looked at her for a moment, then he made a sound that might have been the most compressed possible version of a laugh and walked on. She took it. The days built a rhythm, morning walks and map-making. Breakfast with Fiona, who was becoming a friend in the way that people become friends when they are useful to each other without this diminishing the friendship. It added to it. Council sessions twice a week. Formal introductions to pack elders from 3 territories in the first fortnight, which required her to learn things quickly about the territorial disputes and the seasonal issues each pack faced, because she had learned long ago that the best way to be welcomed by people who had no reason to welcome you was to know something real about what they cared about. She asked Fiona for the council archives on the eastern border disputes. Fiona brought them the same day. She read for 4 hours and then made notes. She asked for the records on the northern river territories. Those came the next morning. She read those too. Lady Sarah found out about the archive requests on the 3rd one. Mara knew she found out because Fiona told her, not as a warning, but as information, matter-of-factly in the way Fiona delivered most things. "Lady Sarah knows you've been requesting the territorial archives," she said. She didn't say anything specific, but she knows. "Good," Mara said. "Good? If she's watching what I'm reading, it means she's taking me seriously. That's better than not." Fiona considered this. That's an unusual way to feel about being monitored. "I've been underestimated my whole life," Mara said. "I know how that ends. I'd rather be overestimated and have to work for it." Callum knocked on the door of her sitting room on the 9th evening. She was at the desk with the Eastern Border papers and a cold cup of tea. She opened the door and he looked at the desk and the papers and the cold tea, and the particular expression on her face that she knew appeared when she was thinking hard. "You're not sleeping," he said. "I'm sleeping," she said. "After." He sat down in the chair near the window without being asked. Which she was starting to understand was how he did things. He did not ask for permission for small things. He simply occupied the space, and the assumption was that you would say something if you objected. She did not object. "The Eastern Border files," he said. "The river access dispute between the Morrow Pack and the Den territory. The mediations have been going for 7 years. There are 12 documented sessions and not one of them addressed the upstream blockage." He was quiet. "The tributary off the main river," she said. 3 miles north of the Morrow boundary. It's in the land survey on page 41 of the 1887 records, but the mediators have been working from the 1902 boundary maps, which predate the tributary diversion. Nobody's been talking about the same piece of land. Silence. "Am I wrong?" she said. "No," he said. "You're right. Has anyone?" "No," he said. "No one has identified that." She looked at the papers. 7 years, she said. Both packs have sent representatives to 12 sessions over 7 years, because nobody checked which map the other side was using. "There are other factors," he said. "Old grievances, family histories. It's not only the map." "It's never only the map," she said. "But if you fix what's wrong with the map, the other grievances have less to stand on." He was looking at her with the expression she was getting better at reading. It was not surprise exactly. It was something closer to. She searched for the word. Confirmation, as if something he had thought was proving itself out, and this was satisfying in a very quiet way. "Don't mention this in the council session yet," he said. "I wasn't going to." "Let me. You need to bring it as a discovery from your own team," she said, "so it doesn't land as a new person trying to show up the council in her first month." He stopped. Yes, he said, after a moment. Exactly that. I'm not new to rooms where I'm not supposed to be the smartest person, she said. I know how to give information away without signing my name to it. He stayed for another hour. They talked through the border issue and 3 others she had questions about from the files. He talked to her differently than he talked to anyone else she had observed, directly, without the careful management of information she had noticed him apply in council sessions and formal meetings. This, she was beginning to understand, was what he was like when the management was not required. She preferred it. After he left, she sat for a while looking at the closed door. She thought about what had happened at the claiming feast, which she had not thought about directly since the first days. She had been too busy learning the palace and the people and the files to spend much time on the shape of the thing she was in. But now, alone in the sitting room with the cold tea and the border papers, she let herself look at it. He had come to Eldon Hollow in broken boots, to find someone who did not perform generosity but practiced it. He had found her. He had walked into the center of a room and said her name. And now they were here, 2 people sitting in a palace in the northern cold, talking through land disputes and archive records and council politics, neither of them pretending the work was not the work, neither of them dressing it up as something warmer or simpler than it was. She thought that was, in its way, its own kind of warmth. She was still thinking about this on the morning that Sarah came to her rooms. Mara had been expecting this visit. Not the specific morning, not the specific excuse. Sarah arrived with a personal invitation to tea and an additional invitation to join her on a walk through the palace's south gardens, which were apparently notable, but the visit itself. You could not read 7 years of council archives without eventually drawing the attention of the woman who had been running the council for 11 of them. The tea was excellent. The south garden was indeed notable. Old boxwood hedges, a reflecting pool that was still and gray in the morning light, a section of medicinal plantings that had been established by some previous king's partner and maintained for 3 generations. Sarah walked her through it with the composed pleasure of someone who genuinely loved the place. "You've been reading the territorial files," Sarah said. "Not a question." "Yes," Mara said. "What did you think of the Den Morrow mediation records?" Mara looked at the reflecting pool. "I thought they were very thorough." And I thought the thoroughness might be obscuring something simpler." Sarah walked 3 steps in silence. "You found the map discrepancy." "Yes." Another silence. Longer. "I found it 8 months ago," Sarah said. Mara looked at her. "I have been managing the introduction of that information carefully," Sarah said, "because the 2 pack elders involved have a personal history that makes neutral cartographic correction insufficient. The map is the surface problem. If we correct the map without addressing the personal problem first, we correct the map and the dispute continues." She said this without any expression of triumph or criticism, just information. Mara thought about it. "What's the personal problem?" she said. "Elder Crane of the Morrow Pack and Elder Voss of the Den territory were, at one time, bonded," Sarah said. "The bond dissolved under difficult circumstances 12 years ago. The territorial dispute began 14 months later. None of the mediators have had access to that information because it's private pack business. But you have it. It is my job to have it." Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the files. 12 sessions, 7 years, 2 people arguing over a river boundary that was partly a map problem and partly grief, and all the mediators trying to solve the map problem and wondering why it wasn't working. "So the question isn't really cartographic," Mara said. "The question is whether 2 people who haven't spoken honestly in 12 years can be brought to the same room without the conversation turning into the old one." "Can they?" "I don't know yet," Sarah said. "I've been finding that out." They were at the far end of the garden now, near the old stone wall that bounded the south side. A few bare branches of something that would be roses in spring hung over the wall. Mara looked at them and thought about the kind of patience it took to manage something for 8 months without forcing it. "You're better at this than I expected," she said. She said it directly, because the conversation had become direct and she did not want to undo that. Sarah looked at her. Whatever Sarah's internal life was, it did not often show on her face. But there was something. A very small acknowledgement, almost architectural, the slight shift of a building adjusting its weight. "You're more practical than I expected," Sarah said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was something more specific than a compliment. It was a revision. An out-loud adjustment of the assessment Mara had understood from the first step down the palace stairs had been ongoing. "I'm going to object to things you do," Sarah said. "I know. Some of those objections will be political instinct. Some will be personal. Which will be harder to work with?" Mara said. Sarah considered this. "The personal ones," she said. "Will you tell me which is which?" No, Sarah said, but I'll try not to confuse them myself. That, Mara thought, was probably the most honest thing Sarah was going to offer in the near future, and she took it. They walked back through the garden. The reflecting pool caught the sky, wide, flat, gray. Mara looked at it and thought, this is what the work is. Not ceremony, not the feast night, not the borrowed dress and the coin. This, the slow, cold, exact work of learning the room, understanding who knows what, knowing which problems are cartographic and which are grief in disguise. She had been doing this work her whole life. She was just doing it somewhere colder now. That evening she found the east corridor by accident. Not the east wing proper, but a narrow connecting passage that the map she'd drawn had marked as a service route that ran between the south wing and the older central part of the building. It was less traveled than the main corridors, and the stones underfoot were worn smoother from centuries of foot traffic, and the candles in this section were smaller and set further apart, so there was more shadow between the pools of light. She had not gone there deliberately. She had been walking to tire herself out before bed, which was a technique she'd used since childhood and still needed. She turned left instead of right somewhere near the third junction, realized her mistake, and was in the process of orienting herself against her mental map when she heard footsteps. Callum came around the corner and stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're lost," he said. "I made a wrong turn," she said. Same thing. Different implication. He was in a plain coat, no formality to him, his hair slightly disordered in a way that meant he had been working alone in a room and running his hands through it. She knew this look because she recognized the source of it. "You couldn't sleep," she said. "Not yet." "The eastern border?" "The eastern border," he confirmed. She sat down. There was a low bench in the alcove of the corridor, made of the same dark stone as the walls, worn smooth like the floor. She sat on it because her feet were tired, and the corridor was quiet, and she did not particularly feel like performing alertness at this hour. He looked at the bench. He sat down beside her. They were in the corridor in the partial dark, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was the honest kind that does not need filling, that is its own form of communication, saying, "I am tired, and so are you, and we do not need to be anything right now. We can just be here." "Sarah came to see me today," she said eventually. "I know." She knew about the map discrepancy already. "I know that too. She's managing it for personal reasons." He was quiet for a beat. "She told you about Crane and Voss?" "Yes. She has never told anyone else that," he said. He stopped. "What?" "That means she's decided something about you," he said. "She doesn't share information without having decided." Mara thought about Sarah at the garden wall, the revision, the acknowledgement, the promise not to confuse her personal and political objections, which was not quite trust but was something in the same general direction. "She's decided I'm practical," Mara said. "That's what she values most," he said. "I know," she said. "I could see that in the council sessions." They sat. The palace made its sounds around them, the settling stone, the distant footstep, the wind. She had learned most of those sounds now. "I don't know what I'm doing yet," she said. It came out simply, without the weight of an admission, because it was just true. "I know what I'm learning. I know how to learn, but I'm not there yet." "No," he said. "Does that concern you?" "No," he said again. "Why not?" "Because you're reading the 7-year files and finding the map problem in 4 days," he said. "Because you gave away information about the Den Morrow boundary in a way that won't embarrass the council, without being asked to. Because you sat in the council session for 2 hours and watched Sarah instead of me, and then told me what you'd seen, and you were right." She looked at the wall opposite. "Because you sat on that road," he said, "and did the math, and gave the coin anyway." She sat with that. Outside the palace, the northern wind was picking up. It came under the door at the end of the corridor and moved along the floor and touched them both, and it was cold, and neither of them moved away from it. "What's the hardest part?" she said. "Not of this, just the hardest part, of being him." She said it because the corridor was dark enough and quiet enough to say it. He thought for a long time. "Knowing what people need," he said, "and having to decide how much of it I can actually give." She understood that very precisely. "Yes," she said. They stayed in the corridor for another half hour. Nobody came. Nobody needed them. The palace breathed around them, and the wind came under the door, and the candles in their alcoves made small moving light. When she got up to go, she found the way back to the south wing without the map. She had not needed to look for it. She already knew. Winter arrived at the northern palace like a decision that had already been made elsewhere. One morning in the 3rd week of her 2nd month there, Mara walked to the window of her sitting room, and the kitchen garden below was white. Not the tentative white of first frost, the full, committed white of snow that had fallen through the night without consulting anyone and settled in to stay. The bare rose branches along the garden wall were furred with it. The reflecting pool in Sarah's garden was covered. The hill beyond was a different shade entirely, the dark green of the pines carrying their weight of snow. She stood at the window for a full minute. She had grown up in Eldon Hollow, which had snow, but the snow of the north was a different creature, heavier, more serious, with a cold behind it that the south never quite managed. She could feel it through the glass. It pressed against the palace like something with intention. She got dressed and went down to the kitchen garden. The cook's assistant she had met on the second night, the one who had walked her back from the wrong corridor, was named Nat. Nat was 17 and lanky and had the particular quality of intelligence that showed up as quickness with his hands rather than with words, and he had been bringing Mara's morning tea himself since the second week after Mara had asked him his name and used it consistently, which had surprised him enough that he'd mentioned it to Fiona, who had told Mara. She had not done it strategically. She had done it because he had a name, and she believed in using names. Nat was in the garden when she came out, brushing snow off the herb beds with a flat board. "It'll be like this until March," he said, without looking up. "Every year?" "Some years longer." She looked at the hill. The pines were extraordinary under the snow, dark green and white, very still, the kind of still that heavy snowfall produced in forests. "Is it always this quiet after it snows?" she said. "Until the wind picks up," Nat said. "Then it's not quiet anymore." She went back inside to breakfast. The palace routine changed with the winter. The territorial lords who had been staying departed before the snow blocked the main roads. The council sessions moved earlier in the day to take advantage of the best light. The corridors were warmer because the fires were lit in more rooms, and the smell of wood smoke became constant and low, and she came to associate it with the feeling of being indoors in the truest sense. The way you were indoors when being outside would have been genuinely difficult. She attended 8 council sessions in her second month. She stopped taking notes after the 4th one because she had remembered enough of the structure to stop needing them. She built a working map of the council's dynamics, who deferred to whom, who challenged what, which arguments were genuine, and which were positional, how the room shifted when Edmund Vane spoke versus when Aldrich spoke. Aldrich's contributions landed like stone, heavy, predictable, but forming their own foundation. Vane's contributions were lighter, more precise, and left more things moving in their wake. She did not trust Edmund Vane. This was not an emotional conclusion. It was an analytical one, reached over the course of 8 sessions and several corridor interactions in which he had been perfectly pleasant and perfectly informative, and had not once said a thing that required him to give anything away. Men who were that consistently pleasant were either very kind or very careful, and Vane did not give the impression of kindness as a primary quality. She mentioned this to Callum on a Thursday evening. They had developed a habit of talking in the evenings without having formally established it. It had simply happened 2 or 3 times a week, in the east corridor or in the sitting room of her chambers or occasionally in the library, which was on the 2nd floor and had the best chairs in the palace. The library visits were her favorite. The chairs were deep, and the shelves were full of territorial history, and the fire burned long in the wide grate, and it was the only room in the palace that asked nothing of her. "Vane is careful," Callum said, from the chair across from hers. He had his feet on the footrest. She had noticed that he was different in private than in council. Not a different person, but a different presentation of the same person. The way a building looks different depending on the light. In council he was still and exact. In the library he was simply tired in the way of someone who has been carrying things all day and has put them down. "Too careful," she said. "He's ambitious," Callum said. "He's been managing me carefully for 2 years." "Managing you toward what?" "That," Callum said, "is what I have not yet been able to determine with certainty. He wants a seat on the council." "He has a seat on the council." "He wants your seat," she said. Callum looked at the fire. "Maybe," he said. "Not maybe," she said. "The way he positions himself in session, he's always at an angle to you, never in full opposition, but never in full support either. He maintains his own weight. He's been building a case for himself as an alternative center of gravity for 2 years, and you said yourself he had his own ambitions he'd never stated." Callum was quiet. "Is this something you'd worked out already?" she said. "Most of it," he said. "What part hadn't you?" "The angle," he said. "The positioning thing." She looked at him. He had a line between his brows that appeared when he was thinking hard, and it was there now. "You're not angry that I said it," she said. "No. You would have preferred to reach it yourself." No, he said again. I would have preferred to have had someone I could say this to a year ago. She looked at the fire. They were quiet for a while in the way that had become normal, the comfortable quiet of two people who did not need to fill every space with sound. She was aware of it, and also aware of the fact that she had not had this specific quality of quiet with another person before. Clara's kitchen was warm and honest, but Clara was a talker. Her mother's house had been quiet, but the silence in her mother's house had never been entirely comfortable, carrying as it did the unspoken weight of everything her mother had not gotten, and had tried to stop wanting, and hadn't quite managed. This was different. This was the quiet of two people who were both thinking and were comfortable with each other's thinking. She did not examine it further that evening. The next morning, Lady Sarah called a formal meeting of the council without Callum, which was within her procedural rights, but which Fiona told Mara with the expression of someone delivering ambiguous weather reports had not happened in 3 years. Why? Mara said. The agenda listed it as a routine quarterly review of council standing orders, Fiona said. Standing orders review doesn't require the king's presence. And standing orders review has never once been called without him. Mara thought about this. Who called it? She said. Sarah? Edmund Vane proposed it, Fiona said. Sarah approved it. Those two things together were interesting. Sarah and Vane working in the same direction, even on a procedural matter, was a combination she had not seen in 8 sessions. They were not natural allies. Sarah was a traditionalist in most things, and Vane was a reformer where reform benefited him. Something had brought them together on this. She went to find Callum. He was in the small office off the main study, a room she had only been in twice, that smelled of paper and lamp oil and the particular concentration of a place where decisions happened. He was reading something when she came in and looked up. You know about the council session, he said. Fiona told me. What do you know that I don't? He put down what he was reading. Vane has proposed a procedural amendment. He's calling it an administrative clarification. What it does, in practice, is add a lineage review requirement for any formal claim that has been declared within the last 60 days. She held still. That's me, she said. Yes. 60 days puts it inside our window. Yes. And it was Vane's proposal. With Sarah's approval, he said. Why would Sarah? Because it's technically lawful, Callum said. And because Sarah, whatever else she is, operates within procedure. If a procedural pathway exists, she will use it rather than something cruder. Vane gave her a clean option. Mara sat down in the chair across from his desk. She looked at the window. The snow on the sill had compacted in the days since the first fall, and was now glazed with ice. Very still, very bright in the morning light. What does the lineage review involve? She said. He told her. A formal presentation before the full council and any attending territorial representatives. A review of bloodline records. A demonstration, in the council's judgment, of what they called territorial standing. The capacity to represent and manage the interests of the pack at the king's level. It was a mechanism that had been written into pack law during a period 2 centuries ago when a disputed claim had destabilized an entire territory, and it had been invoked 3 times in northern pack history, always in cases of political difficulty. They'll present it as protection, he said. A safeguard. They'll say it's not about you specifically. But it is. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at the glazed snow on the sill. She thought about 2 things simultaneously. The first was the particular variety of anger that came from being used as a procedural object, not quite rage, but the flat, cold-oriented anger of someone who has been moved around a board without being asked. The second was what she was going to do about it. The anger was real, and she let it be real. She did not perform calm she did not have. But she also knew, with the precision of someone who had been navigating rooms where she was not quite welcome for her entire life, that the anger was a resource rather than a direction. It would power the work. It would not dictate the strategy. Can you stop it? She said. I can delay it, he said. I can make procedural objections to Vane's proposed amendment. That buys time. Don't, she said. He looked at her. If you delay it, it becomes an issue about you and Vane, she said. That's what Vane wants. He wants you to push back procedurally, so the story becomes the king, overriding the council's legitimate oversight function. Let the amendment pass. Let the review happen. Callum was very still. You understand what that means, he said. I have to stand before the full council and whatever territorial observers show up, she said, and present a bloodline case that doesn't exist in any way they'll find comfortable. Yes. Fine, she said. Mara. I know what I have, she said. I also know what they're expecting me to have. There's an argument to be made in the difference between those two things, and I'm going to make it. She paused. Give me time to prepare. 3 weeks. He was looking at her with that expression again, the quiet, specific, confirming one. I'll give you 4, he said. 3 is enough. 4, he said, because I want you prepared, not just ready. She did not argue. She went back to her rooms and she told Fiona what was happening, and Fiona's face did the complicated series of things it did when she was processing news she considered problematic, and then she straightened up and said, What do you need? Everything the council has ever accepted as evidence of territorial standing, Mara said. Every historical review, every precedent, and the 3 previous cases where this was invoked. I want the full records, not the summaries. Fiona had everything on her desk by the end of the day. Mara read for 6 hours. She read through dinner, eating at the desk without noticing what she was eating, which Fiona recognized and compensated for by bringing food that did not require attention. She read until the fire in the sitting room burned low and she had to stop and rebuild it, and while she was on her knees at the grate with the tongs, she was still thinking about the 1789 case, which was the closest precedent to her situation, and which had gone badly for the claimant, because the claimant's representation had been built entirely on bloodline records that the council found incomplete. The claimant had lost because she had tried to play the council's game by the council's rules, and the council's rules were written to favor people who already had everything the rules required. Mara sat back on her heels in front of the rebuilt fire. She was not going to play the council's game. She was going to change what game was being played. She sat at the desk again and started over. She wrote for 2 hours, not reading anymore, just writing. The shape of the argument, the structure of it, what she was going to say and in what order and why. She had given information away before without signing her name to it. This time she was going to sign her name to it. She was going to stand in the center of that room and claim everything she was and everything she wasn't, because the only thing more powerful than having what the council wanted was not needing the council's version of what was wanted. She had been a seamstress's daughter with no bloodline worth mentioning her entire life. She was going to walk into that room and be exactly that. And she was going to show them why it was enough. Not performing. Not borrowing someone else's dress and hoping the room would see what it wanted to see. Just Mara Else Weston, in her own clothes with her own words, making the argument that she had earned the right to make by being alive and paying attention and going past the math when the math said no. She wrote until 2 in the morning. She went to bed and slept deeply and did not dream of the feast hall or the coin or the borrowed dress or her mother's 20 years. She dreamed of the pines on the hill in the snow, dark green and white, very still, carrying their weight without bending. She woke up knowing exactly what she was going to say. In the 3 weeks before the review, Mara did 4 things. She read every available record from every territorial dispute that had come before the council in the past 11 years. Not because she planned to demonstrate knowledge of them. That would look like preparation designed to impress, which was a different thing from being prepared. She read them because she needed to understand what the council actually did when they were not performing the council. And records were where the actual work showed up. What she found was that Sarah's fingerprints were on every resolution that it held, not loudly, not with her name on the formal decision in most cases, but in the preliminary notes, in the pattern of questions asked, in the way certain proposals had been shaped before they reached the formal vote. Sarah did not run the council from the center. She ran it from the architecture of the thing. She built the rooms that the decisions lived in. That told Mara what Sarah valued, which was more useful than knowing what she opposed. The second thing she did was talk to territorial representatives. There were 3 in the palace during this period, 2 visiting from the southern territories on other business, and 1, a man named Owen Farr from the river border territories, who had been in residence for several weeks as part of the ongoing Den Morrow mediation that Sarah was managing. Owen Farr was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with the permanent expression of someone who has been cold a lot and has made peace with it. He had not paid her particular attention in their initial introduction, which she had expected. She found him in the long gallery on the 2nd floor one evening, looking at the portraits. "The painting is wrong," she said. He looked at her. "Which one?" "The one of the 4th territorial convening." She nodded at a large canvas on the right wall, a formal scene of ranked figures in the old court style, stiff and hieratic. "The boundary markers in the background are placed incorrectly for where the convening actually happened. The color of the stone is wrong too. There's gray limestone in that part of the Den territory, not the red sandstone they've painted." Farr looked at the painting more carefully. He was quiet for a moment. You know the Den territory, he said. I've been reading the survey records, she said, since I arrived. He looked at her with the remeasuring expression she was getting good at identifying, the slight recalibration behind the eyes. What else is wrong with the painting? He said. They talked for an hour and a half. She did not use it to make a case for herself. She used it to learn about the river territories from someone who actually lived in them, which was more useful than the archive records for a different category of knowledge. What she learned, the Morrow Pack's primary grievance was not really the water access. The water access was the presenting wound. The deeper issue was that the Morrow Pack had been losing young members to the Den territory for 2 generations, young people who moved south for better seasonal work and did not always come back. The population decline was making the pack feel vulnerable, and the river dispute was the form the vulnerability had taken. You could not fix the river dispute without addressing the population issue. She did not say this to Farr. She stored it for the review. The third thing she did was draft a letter. It was to the 3 outer territory packs that had not sent representatives to her formal introduction, not because they were hostile, but because they were distant and the winter had closed the roads. She wrote to their elders directly. Not a political letter. A letter of introduction, plainly and personally written, asking about the conditions in their territories, noting what she had read in the historical records about the difficulties their areas had faced in the past 2 years, and acknowledging that she was new, and still learning, and intended to learn from them, rather than explain things to them. She sent all 3 letters. Within 2 weeks, 2 responses arrived. The third came the morning before the review. All 3 were cautious but not hostile, and all 3 said, in different ways, that they appreciated being written to at all. The fourth thing she did was nothing in particular. She ate her meals and walked the corridors and sat in the East Corridor bench twice more with Callum, and attended council sessions and watched Vane position himself, and watched Aldrich not bother to position himself, and watched Sarah manage everything from the architecture. She talked to Nat in the kitchen garden when the snow was being managed, and she talked to Fiona about her sisters, and she read in the library. She let the palace become her place rather than her assignment. That was the fourth thing, and it was the hardest, and also the most important. The morning of the review she woke at 5. She dressed herself without Fiona's help, which was a choice. She wore the same clothes she had worn to the council sessions, the dark green wool that was hers, that she had bought with the money from 3 weeks of close work alterations the previous spring, that fit her the way things fit when they had been chosen rather than assigned. She pinned her hair the way she always pinned it. She ate breakfast at the desk. At 9:30, Fiona came and walked with her to the council chamber. The room had been rearranged for the occasion. The regular council table was there, with Sarah and the 6 members in their seats, but additional chairs had been placed along the walls for the territorial observers. 5 of them had been brought in for this, which was more than Mara had expected. She saw Owen Farr among them and one of the southern territorial lords from earlier in her stay, and 3 faces she did not recognize. Edmund Vane was at his usual place at the council table. He nodded at her when she entered, in the way of someone who was performing graciousness from a position of confidence. Callum was not in the room. He had agreed to this. She had asked him, the night before, not to be present. "If you're there," she had said, "the room watches you watch me. I want them watching me." He had agreed without argument. She stood in the center of the council chamber, in front of the table and the 7 members and the 5 territorial observers, in the dark green wool with her hair pinned back, and she was aware of being exactly what she was and having nothing to hide any of it behind, which was simultaneously the most exposed feeling she had ever had and the most settled. She began. "I am Mara Else Weston," she said. "I am the daughter of Adela Weston, who was the daughter of Hugh Weston, who was the 3rd son of a river farming family in the southern territory of Eldon Hollow. None of you will find those names in the landholding records or the lineage tables this council has historically used to assess territorial standing. I am not going to argue that this is an oversight. It is not. My family has no formal territorial standing by the definitions written into pack law 2 centuries ago." Complete silence. "What I am going to argue," she said, "is that what those definitions were written to measure, the capacity to understand, represent, and advance the interests of the pack, is something that can be demonstrated by evidence of a different kind. Not bloodline records, not landholding. Evidence of what a person has actually done with what they actually have." She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not read from notes. She had written the argument out in full, and then she had put the papers down and rebuilt it in her head until it was hers, until she could hold all of it without looking at anything outside herself, because she needed to be able to look at the room. She talked about the Den Morrow dispute, not the map problem, Callum's team had already begun addressing that through internal channels, as she and Callum had agreed. She talked about the population issue that sat underneath the water rights argument, which she had learned from Owen Farr, and about the historical records showing that 3 similar border disputes in other territories had resolved when the underlying population pressure was addressed rather than the presenting territorial claim. She named the records, she named the years. She looked at the territorial observers when she said it, including Farr, who was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. She talked about the 3 letters she had written. She did not cite them as achievements. She cited them as evidence of methodology, of how she intended to learn, from whom, and why. She read brief passages from the responses she had received, because the responses said things about how the outer territories saw themselves that the council, she had come to understand, did not always fully account for. She talked about her mother. One sentence. She said, "My mother spent 20 years in a village where the official record of her worth was a series of entries in the passing over column of a claiming feast ledger, and what she taught me, not in words but in practice, was that the official record of a person's worth is always behind the actual fact of it. This council has the opportunity to act on the fact rather than wait for the record to catch up." She stopped. The chamber was very quiet. She had been looking at different parts of the room throughout. The council members, the observers, the window behind Sarah where the snow light came through and made everything very clear, and now she looked at the center of the table, at the empty air above the ledger that Harwick's equivalent in this chamber would later use to record the vote. Lord Aldrich coughed. He had been very still throughout. He was still now. He looked at his hands, which were folded on the table, and then he looked up at her with the expression of a man who has revised his category. "The Morrow Den population issue," he said. His voice was as dry as everything else about him. "You identified this from the survey records?" "From the survey records and a conversation with Elder Farr," she said. Aldrich looked at Farr. Farr inclined his head once, slightly. Aldrich looked back at Mara. Something in his face made a decision. She could see it happen, which was unusual. He was not a man who usually showed the process of his thinking. Vane spoke. "The presentation is thoughtful," he said. His voice was precisely calibrated, acknowledging without endorsing. "However, the council's review is specifically of bloodline and lineage standing, and what we've heard does not directly—" "Edmund." Sarah's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Vane stopped. Sarah was looking at the space above the council table. Her hands were flat on the surface. Whatever was happening inside her, it was not visible, which was normal, except that the flatness of her hands was not her normal posture, and Mara had been watching Sarah's hands for 2 months. "The review," Sarah said, "is of territorial standing. The definition of territorial standing is within the council's discretionary interpretation." She paused. "I have heard enough to form a view." The room waited. "The measure of territorial standing," Sarah said, "has always been whether a person can understand what the pack needs and work toward it with competence and integrity. The bloodline provisions exist because for most of this council's history, bloodline was used as a proxy for that understanding. The proxy is not the thing." She paused again. "The thing is what I have just heard." Vane was very still. "Lady Sarah," he started. "I'll hear the vote," Sarah said. The vote was 4-3 in favor of confirmed standing. Aldrich voted in favor. Sarah voted in favor. 2 of the other council members voted in favor. Vane voted against. 2 others voted with him. 4-3. Mara stood in the center of the chamber, and the vote was read by the council's formal recorder, and she felt the number settle around her like a room settling after a door has been opened and the air has moved, and then the door has been closed again, and everything is at a new equilibrium. 4-3. Not unanimous. Not a triumph in the sweeping sense. A working majority. She would take it. Farr was the first observer to rise. He stood up from his chair against the wall and gave a single formal nod. The old territorial acknowledgement, the one that meant "I see you as a peer of standing," that she knew from the historical records but had never seen performed before. The Southern Lord rose after him and did the same. The 3 unfamiliar observers followed. Vane did not stand. He was looking at the table. Sarah met Mara's eyes across the chamber for one moment. Mara could not fully read what was in her expression, but she recognized the quality of it. The look of a woman who has made a decision and done the work to hold it, and who is not entirely comfortable with the outcome, and who is also not going to pretend she didn't just make it. Mara nodded at her. Sarah nodded back. She walked out of the chamber and into the corridor, and Callum was there, leaning against the wall 10 steps from the door, and he looked at her face and she looked at his, and she told him 4-3, and he let out a long breath that told her he had been holding it. "Sarah voted in favor," she said. "I didn't expect that," he said. "I think I did," she said. She's practical. You told her that yourself. She also values the thing more than the proxy, Mara said, when it came down to it. Whatever her reservations about me specifically. He was quiet for a moment. Vane will not leave this alone, he said. No, she said. I know. He has options that are more significant than procedural amendments. I know that too. She looked at the corridor wall. Gray stone, old, wearing its years evenly. Tell me what those options are, she said. All of them. Tonight. I want to stop guessing at the shape of what's coming and start knowing it. Tonight, he agreed. They walked down the corridor together, not speaking, and through the junction near the kitchen access and up the staircase to the south wing, and she was not following him and he was not leading her. They were simply moving in the same direction at the same pace, which she thought was probably the most accurate picture of what they were doing in the larger sense as well. 4-3. She had said what was true about herself in the center of a room that had not expected her to be there, and 4 people had heard it and found it sufficient. She had not needed the bloodline. She had not needed the borrowed dress. She had needed what she had always had, the willingness to look at the thing honestly and say what she saw, even when the math said no one was listening. Someone was always listening. That was the thing they never put in the calculations, and it was the thing that kept turning out to matter most. Vane moved faster than she expected. She had thought she had more time, not because she had underestimated him exactly, but because she had assumed he would need time to recalibrate after the review, to absorb the 4-3 result, to reassess his options, to rebuild his position quietly before he moved again. Men of his kind usually took that time. They valued not being seen to react. She had 10 days before the next move. Fiona told her about it on a Tuesday morning, standing in the doorway of the sitting room with a particular kind of stillness that Mara had learned to read as the body language of someone carrying news they would prefer not to carry. Lord Vane has submitted a formal request to the king, Fiona said, to open the trade negotiation files from the eastern border. He cited the review outcome as justification. Specifically, your mention of the population movement issue. He's argued that if territorial standing has been granted on the basis of that analysis, the Council should formally examine whether the current trade agreements with the Den territory are contributing to the population decline in the border pacts. Mara was quiet for a moment. She turned this over. He's using my review argument, she said. He's extending it, Fiona said, in a direction that implicates King Callum's current trade policy. Which Vane has been arguing against for how long? 18 months, Fiona said, in increasingly formal terms. She looked at the window. The snow had come again overnight, lighter than the first fall, a thin new white over the old compacted layer, smoothing out the gray. She thought about the architecture of what Vane had just done, which was genuinely clever. He had taken the argument she had made to demonstrate her fitness for the position she was in, and used it as a lever to apply pressure to the man whose support had put her there. He had made her into a problem for Callum. And if Callum distanced himself from her argument to protect his trade policy, he undermined the basis on which her standing had been granted. And if he supported her argument, he opened the trade files to council scrutiny in an election cycle for the territorial council seats that was happening in the spring. Both forks of that were uncomfortable. She recognized this kind of thinking. It was the most efficient kind of opposition, not a direct attack, but a structural one. You do not need to break the wall down if you can make the wall an inconvenience to the person who built it. Where is Callum? She said. He called an early session with his senior advisors, Fiona said, an hour ago. Is Sarah there? Yes. Aldrich? Yes. Not Vane, she said. It was not a question. Vane submitted the request in writing, Fiona said. He's not in the meeting. Of course he wasn't. He had sent the move. He did not need to be in the room to watch it play out. She sat at the desk and thought for 15 minutes without writing anything. She thought about the eastern border files and the Den territory trade agreements and the conversation she had had with Owen Farr in the long gallery, and about the population movement issue she had raised in the review, and about whether she had raised it knowing this could happen, or whether she had been naive and had simply handed Vane a tool she hadn't seen him reaching for. She had not been naive. She had known the population issue was politically sensitive. She had used it in the review because it was true, and because it was the most direct evidence she had of the kind of analysis she could bring to the council's work, and she had taken the risk that Vane would find a way to use it against her. She had taken the risk consciously because the alternative was to stay within safe bounds in the review and lose, and she had decided that losing safely was not a useful option. So she had given him the tool. The question was what she did now. She thought about this for 15 more minutes. Then she got up and went to the council session. She was not invited. That was all right. She had not been uninvited either, and the council's standing orders did not specifically prohibit her from attending senior advisor sessions as an observer, any more than they had prohibited her from attending the council sessions themselves, and she had done that for 3 months. She opened the door and the room looked at her. Callum, at the head of the table, with Sarah and Aldrich and 4 other senior members. They looked at her the way people look at something that was expected, but not expected right now. She sat down in the observer's chair along the wall, the one that was hers. "Continue," she said. The room continued. She listened for 20 minutes. The argument was circling the problem without touching the center of it, which was that Vane had put both Callum and the council's new position on Mara into the same uncomfortable box, and nobody in the room wanted to say that directly, because saying it directly required admitting that Vane had outmaneuvered them. She waited until a pause in the circling. "Open the files," she said. Everyone looked at her. "Vane's request is legitimate," she said. "He extended an argument that I made in a formal review. If that argument has standing, then the request to examine its policy implications also has standing. Rejecting it doesn't undo the argument. It just makes it look like the argument was only good when it was convenient for us." Aldrich made a sound. It was not agreeable or disagreeable. It was the sound of someone paying close attention. "If we open the files," one of the senior advisors said, a man named Brooke, competent and conservative, "we give Vane direct access to the trade negotiation records during a council election period." "We give him access he was probably going to find a different way to get eventually," Mara said. "And by giving it to him openly, we control the terms of review. We can establish the process, the timeline, and who manages the analysis." "Who do you suggest manages the analysis?" Sarah said. "A joint committee," Mara said. "Vane on it. He has to be. He made the request. Owen Farr is the territorial representative with direct relevance, and someone from within the council who can keep the process from becoming a political campaign document." She looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at her with his category-revising expression. "You're suggesting me," he said. "I'm suggesting you," she said, "because you've been on the council for 30 years and you have no election to win in the spring, and you find Vane's ambitions as tiresome as anyone, and you have enough standing that if Vane tries to turn the process into theater, you can stop it." Aldrich was quiet. "That's accurate," he said. He did not say it warmly. He said it the way you say a true thing. "It's also the option Vane did not plan for," she said. He expected either a flat rejection, which he could use as evidence of defensiveness, or an open review that he could run. He did not plan for a structured review run by Aldrich. The room was very quiet. Callum was looking at her from the head of the table. She had not looked directly at him since she came in, and she looked at him now. His expression was one she had not seen before, not the quiet confirming one, not the tired private one, not the careful public one. This was different. This was the expression of a man who was watching something and understanding, for the first time, the full scale of what he was watching. "I'll put it to Aldrich formally," Callum said. "I accept," Aldrich said, without waiting for the formality. That was either 60 or 100 years of combined experience pointing in the same direction, and Mara thought it would be enough. Sarah was looking at her hands, the flat-palmed posture again. Mara watched it and thought that what was happening inside Sarah's carefully managed interior was something she genuinely would like to understand better, and that she probably would, eventually, if she had enough time and enough patience. She had the patience. She stayed for the rest of the session. After it ended, as the room cleared, Brooke stopped beside her. "That was well done," he said quietly, with the air of a man giving credit where it was due, and finding it slightly inconvenient to do so. "Thank you," she said. He left. Aldrich left, without speaking to her but with a nod that carried weight. Sarah left, with the composed deliberateness of Sarah always leaving a room. Callum stayed. They were alone in the council chamber. She was still in the observer's chair. He was at the head of the table. "You knew about this before you came in," he said. "Fiona told me. You decided to come anyway." "If I stay in the south wing when there's a problem to be addressed," she said, "I'm a guest. If I come to the room, I'm something else." "Something else," he said. "The thing you declared a claim for," she said. "The thing I agreed to be." He was looking at her steadily. She had said it plainly because it was plain, and because they had established in the library and the east corridor and the kitchen garden and the hours of talking in between, that they did not manage each other's information, and did not smooth things over when the direct thing was available. Vane is not going to stop, he said. I know. The trade file review will be the first real move. The spring council election is the next one. I know. He'll stand candidates in 3 territorial elections, Callum said. If even 2 of them win, his block on the council goes from 3 to 5. 5 votes can do things that 3 cannot. Then we need to talk to the territories before spring, she said. We. Unless you'd prefer to go alone, she said. He looked at the window. The light was going. Late afternoon in winter came early and left quickly, and the chamber was dimming toward the low, warm light of early evening. The Morrow Pack first, he said. The river territories. Before Vane's candidates start making visits. And the Pharaoh Pack in the west, she said. Owen Farr will give us a proper introduction. You talked to Farr? He was looking at a wrong painting, she said. We talked for a while. Something. The small, quiet expression. The confirming one. March, he said. When the roads are workable. March, she agreed. That evening she wrote letters. Not political letters, personal ones. To the 3-pack elders who had written back to her initial introduction, thanking them for their responses and asking specific questions about the things they had mentioned. She wrote to Clara. She wrote to her mother again, a longer letter this time, about the snow and the pines on the hill and the strange way that the north felt like something she had been heading toward for a long time without knowing it. She did not write about Vane or the review or the 4-3 vote. Her mother had her own relationship with rooms that did not want her. She did not need to be given another one to worry about. She wrote about the kitchen garden and Nat brushing snow off the herbs, and the old tree in the courtyard that had been there longer than any part of the palace, and the library with the good chairs, and the fire in the grate on cold evenings, and the way the pines on the hill looked after fresh snow, dark and white and very still and carrying their weight without bending. She sealed the letter and gave it to Fiona for the Morning Post. She sat at the window for a while in the dark, not thinking exactly, past thinking, in the state that came after a day that had required everything. Her mind was still moving but gently, like water after a current has passed through it. She thought about March, the road to the Morrow Pack, the river territories and the population issue she had named in the review room, which was real and needed addressing regardless of what Vane tried to do with it. She thought about making that trip with Callum, which would be the first time they were away from the palace together, which was different from being in the palace together in ways she had not yet fully mapped. She thought about the East Corridor bench. She thought about him saying, the hardest part is knowing what people need and having to decide how much of it I can give. She had understood that. She had said yes. She had said that directly and he had heard it. And they had sat in the corridor for another half hour, and something between them had settled further into itself, taking up more space and more shape. And she had not examined it carefully because there had always been something else that needed examining, and also because she had a habit, when something was still growing, of not looking at it too directly. Things grew better when you were not watching them every second. She would let it grow. March would take care of itself. She went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks. Her dreams were quiet. When she woke at 5 and went to the window, the kitchen garden below was blue dark in the pre-dawn and perfectly still, and a single set of tracks crossed the snow from the gate to the herb beds and back again, which meant Nat had already been here, already working in the dark before the day asked anything of him. She watched the snow until the light changed. She was learning this place. The place was learning her back. The roads to the river territories opened in the last week of February, not March. The winter had been hard but brief in the way of northern winters that know what they are doing. They came fully, and they committed, and then they withdrew without lingering. And by the last days of February, the main southern road from the palace was clear, and the river road that ran west toward the Morrow Packland had been reported passable by the outriders, who were sent to check it. Callum decided to go on the 5th of March regardless, to allow the roads another week. Mara agreed with the timeline but used the extra days. She wrote to Elder Crane of the Morrow Pack herself. Not a letter of introduction. She had sent that in the initial round and received a polite, careful response. This was a different letter. She wrote about the files she had read and the population records and the way the numbers showed something that could be addressed with a different kind of policy, not territorial concessions, but with a structural program, a seasonal apprenticeship arrangement between the border packs that would give young people from the Morrow territory skilled work opportunities in the southern Den districts without requiring them to permanently relocate, something that turned the population flow into a circulation rather than a drain. She did not frame it as a solution, she framed it as a question. Was this the kind of thing that would be worth discussing? Elder Crane's response came in 5 days. It was the longest letter she had received from any pack elder. It said yes. She showed the exchange to Callum the evening before they left. He read both letters twice. He put them down. He looked at the window. "You worked this out from the files," he said. "And from talking to Farr," she said. "He told me about the young people leaving. He said it had been going on long enough that some of the Morrow pack had stopped thinking of it as a problem and had started thinking of it as the way things were." And Crane responded. "She's been watching her pack shrink for 20 years, Mara said. "She'll respond to anything that takes the problem seriously. Vane hasn't taken the problem seriously. Vane has taken the political dimension of the problem seriously," she said. "That's different. Elder Crane knows the difference." Callum folded the letters and handed them back. He was quiet in the particular way that meant he was not finished thinking, and she waited. "You understand," he said, "that if the Morrow Den arrangement goes through, it resolves the primary grievance behind the river dispute, which means Aldrich's trade file review loses its most significant territorial evidence base." "I know." "Which weakens Vane's position in the spring election cycle." "I know that too." "You knew this when you wrote to Crane." "I was thinking primarily about the people who are leaving the Morrow territory," she said, "and the fact that I said I'd address it, in the review room, and I needed to not have said a thing I didn't do." He looked at her steadily. "But you also knew the political consequence." "Both things can be true," she said. He was quiet. "Yes," he said. They left the next morning. The traveling party was smaller than the journey from Eldon Hollow. Mara, Callum, Fiona, 2 of Callum's senior attendants, and 4 outriders. The covered coach had been replaced with 2 open carriages fitted with warm side curtains, which could be raised or lowered as the weather required. The March air was sharp and bright, the snow reduced on the main road to packed gray ice at the margins and clear stone in the center. She rode in the open carriage and kept the side curtains down and watched the territory they were crossing. The land north of the palace was different from anything she had grown up in. It was wider, not the wide of flat open fields but the wide of long valleys and high ridges, the land holding itself in contours that suggested something older than anything she knew how to name. The forests were mostly pine, dark and standing, with occasional sections of bare birch that made white stands against the evergreen. Rivers moved through the valleys, still carrying some of their winter volume, running fast and very clear over stone beds that you could see from the road. She thought, "I have been reading about this place for 4 months. Looking at it was different." They stopped the first night at a way house maintained for court travelers, warm, plain, well-stocked with firewood and food. Callum ate supper across the table from her and they talked through the approach to Elder Crane and to Elder Voss of the Den territory whom they would meet 2 days after. They had decided to see both elders on the same trip, which was unusual. The 2 packs had been in formal dispute for 7 years, and a joint visit carried the risk of either side seeing it as favoritism toward the other. But Mara had argued that the risk of that interpretation was lower than the cost of appearing to separate the issues when the issues were connected, and Callum had agreed. Gwen, who had been present and largely unobtrusive since the first coach journey, offered, over the supper plates, the information that the Morrow pack was predominantly female in its elder structure, which Mara had known from the files but was useful to hear confirmed in practice. "Elder Crane doesn't trust male intermediaries," Gwen said. "From what I've heard, the past mediators were both men." "That might be part of why it didn't work," Mara said. "It might," Gwen agreed. Callum said nothing. He was making a note. The second day of travel brought them into river territory proper, and the change was immediate. The wide valleys closed down into something narrower, the ridges higher on either side, and the river that gave the territory its name appeared on the left side of the road and stayed there. A constant presence, brown-green and fast, moving with the authority of water that has been this river for a very long time and intends to continue. The Morrow Pack settlement was a collection of stone buildings on a bluff above the river, set back enough from the bank to be out of flood range but close enough that you could hear the water from the main courtyard. It had the look of a place built by people who intended to stay, nothing ornamental, everything solid, the stones fitted with the same careful precision as the palace causeways. Elder Crane met them at the gate. She was in her 60s, with gray hair cut close and the wind-reddened face of someone who spent significant time outdoors regardless of season. She looked at Mara first, before looking at Callum, which was notable and intentional, and which Mara acknowledged with a direct nod. "You wrote to me," Crane said, to Mara. "I wrote to you," Mara said. "Come in," Crane said, and she held the gate, and they came in. The meeting with Crane lasted 4 hours. They sat in the pack's main hall, low-ceilinged, warm from a fire that was built for use rather than display, with the smell of wood smoke and river and pack stone floors. Crane had 3 of her senior pack members with her. Mara had Callum and Fiona. Gwen waited outside with the attendants. Crane was not easy. She was not hostile, but she was not easy. She had spent 7 years in mediation sessions that had not worked, and she had the particular quality of someone who has been carefully hopeful too many times, and has learned to hold the careful part and leave the hopeful part outside. She asked questions that were exact and did not accept approximate answers, and Mara gave her exact answers, and when she did not know something exactly she said so, and Crane's expression shifted slightly, which was the right shift. The apprenticeship arrangement took 2 hours to reach an outline, not a formal agreement that would require Den's involvement, but an outline of the structure that Crane was willing to bring to her pack. Seasonal placement 2 years initially, rotating disciplines, with the Den territory agreeing in advance to a specific population cap on permanent resettlement from Morrow land. The cap was the difficult part. Crane wanted it written into the agreement rather than handled by custom. Custom changes, Crane said. Written agreements are harder to change without someone noticing. Yes, Mara said. We'll write it in. Callum had said almost nothing for the last hour. He had been watching the room and making occasional notes. Now he said, the cap number. Crane told him the number. He did not react. He wrote it down. That's workable, he said. Crane looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him with something other than formal acknowledgement. You're not going to negotiate it, Crane said. It's her pack, he said. She knows the number. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Mara with an expression that was hard to name, and very clear. They stayed for supper. Crane sat across from Mara, and the conversation moved away from the formal territory into something less structured. The river. The winter just ended. The spring planting schedule that the pack had to start thinking about in the next month. Mara listened and asked about the crops and the fishing season, and the specific character of the river at this stretch of the bluff. And Crane answered with the pleasure of someone who was asked about the real content of her life, rather than the political context of it. At the end of the evening at the gate, Crane looked at Mara for a moment. You're not what I was expecting, she said. What were you expecting? Someone playing at understanding the problem, Crane said. Most of what we've had from the capital in 7 years has been people who understand the political problem. You understand the actual one. I read your records, Mara said. All of them. Not just the mediation files. The pack records, the seasonal reports, the census figures. Why? Because the problem is in the real details, Mara said, not in the political surface. Crane looked at her steadily. Then she turned and said goodbye to Callum, formally, and went back inside the gate. The ride to the Den territory took another day. Elder Voss was younger than Crane, early 50s, with the wariness of someone who had been in the position long enough to have been involved in both the beginning and the current state of a 7-year dispute. He was more careful with Mara than Crane had been, which was understandable. She brought the outline of the Morrow conversation to him on the second meeting day. She did not present it as settled, she presented it as an opening. Voss read it. He read it 3 times. The population cap, he said. Non-negotiable from the Morrow side, she said, but workable from yours. He looked at her. How do you know it's workable from my side? Because the Den territory's seasonal labor shortage in the northern districts has been documented in your own council filings for 6 years, she said. A cap on permanent settlement doesn't help your labor shortage. A managed inflow of seasonal workers does. The cap doesn't limit the inflow. It limits the permanent conversion of inflow to settlement. Voss was quiet for a long time. You've read our internal filings, he said. They were in the mediation archives, she said. Appended to the 4th session records. He looked at the outline. 12 months, he said, to bring this to our pack elders. 6, she said, because 12 is long enough for the political situation to change. Voss looked at her with something that might have been appreciation for the directness of that. 8, he said. 8, she agreed. On the ride back to the palace, on the second day, she watched the pines and the river and the long valleys in the late winter light, and she let herself be simply present in it, without thinking about anything in particular. Callum rode beside the carriage for a stretch of the afternoon road, and she lowered the side curtain and they talked without much weight to it. About the meeting, about Crane's cook who had made the best river trout she had ever eaten, about the age of the Morrow Bluff buildings and what they said about the pack that had built them. Crane called you what I was expecting, she said. Or rather, not what she was expecting. I heard, he said. Is that a common response? No, he said. Crane has never said that to anyone. How do you know? Because she told me when I was taking my leave, he said. She said, your queen is the first person from the capital in 11 years who came here knowing the actual problem. She did not say anything. "Your queen," he said again, and it landed differently the second time, in the space between them, with more weight. She looked at the river. The water was fast and very clear over the stone. "Not yet officially," she said. "No," he said. "Not yet." The palace appeared on the fourth morning of the return journey, dark against the sky, solid and familiar in a way that surprised her. It had become familiar, she realized. Without noticing, over the months, it had become the place she recognized as home's shape. Fiona met them at the gate with three things: the news that the Aldrich Committee had submitted its preliminary report on the trade file review, which was favorable, the news that Vane had met with two of his potential spring election candidates over the previous week, which was not a surprise, and a letter from Clara that had arrived 2 days ago and was sitting on Mara's desk. She read Clara's letter at the desk in the sitting room before she read the trade report. Clara had had a baby, a girl. They had named her after her mother, and also, she wrote, a little bit after Mara, which was not a name you could do directly, but was a feeling you could build into a name if you chose the right letters. She wrote this without explanation, and Mara understood it perfectly. Clara had always been a person who communicated in the real spaces between words. She put the letter down and sat for a moment. She thought about Eldon Hollow and the kitchen table, and the bitter tea and the borrowed dress and the road and the coin. She thought about how different her life looked from the outside of it compared to how it had looked from the inside at the time. How the road had simply been a road she walked down to a feast she did not expect to matter, and the coin had simply been a coin she could not afford, and the man had simply been a man in the cold. And now there was a committee report on her desk and 8 months of documents she had read, and Elder Crane saying, "Not what I was expecting," and a baby in Eldon Hollow named a little bit after her. Things accreted. That was the thing nobody told you. You did the next thing and the next thing, and the things piled up, and eventually you looked back, and what had looked like a series of individual choices looked like a direction. She had always been heading here. She had not known that from inside it. She was still inside it, of course. March was not the end. Vane's spring candidates were not the end. The coronation was not yet scheduled, and the formal title was not yet given, and the Den Morrow arrangement had 8 months of pack elder consultation ahead of it before anything was signed. But she was no longer arriving. She was here. She picked up the Trade Committee report and began to read. Spring came to the Northern Territory without asking permission, and without apologizing for winter. It arrived in the kitchen garden first. Nat noticed it before anyone else did, which seemed right, since he was the one who had been in that garden every morning through the snow. One Tuesday in the second week of April, he knocked on Mara's sitting room door and said, "The roses are coming." She went to the window and looked. He was right. Along the south wall, where the bare branches had hung through the winter, small shoots of green were appearing at the joints, tentative and very deliberate. She stood at the window for a full minute looking at them. "How long?" she said. 3 weeks, maybe 4, he said. "They bloom late up here. The cold holds them back, and then they come all at once." She nodded, and he went back to work, and she stood at the window a little longer than was strictly necessary, because the green on the winter branches was worth the extra time. The spring council election was in the 4th week of April. By the 2nd week of the month, the political shape of it was clear. Vane had put forward 2 candidates in 3 territories, one strong and one backup in each case, which was the calculation of a man who was working with realistic odds rather than optimistic ones. The territories in question were the eastern border districts where the Den Morrow dispute had historically been most visible, and where Vane's argument about the trade policy had the most natural audience. What Vane had not calculated was the Den Morrow outline. The arrangement she had reached with Crane and Voss in March was not yet formal. The 8-month consultation period had only just begun, and nothing was signed. But the structure of it had moved through the border pack communities in the way that useful information moved, quickly and without needing official channels. By mid-April, the Morrow pack was talking about it as real. By the time the election week arrived, the 2 Vane candidates in the eastern districts were running on a platform of trade policy reform in territories that had just heard, from their own elders, that there was a workable arrangement in progress. The floor had shifted. Not because Mara had planned the timing. She had not. She had worked on the Den Morrow problem because Elder Crane needed it addressed, and because she had said, in the review room, that she would address it. The timing was a consequence of the work taking the time it took. Vane won one of his 3 targeted seats. His 2 backup candidates lost. It was not a defeat for him. 1 seat was still 1 seat. But it was not the configuration he had planned for. And the week after the election, for the first time since she had been in the palace, Vane came to find her. She was in the library. He knocked at the open door and stood in the frame with the particular posture of someone who has made a strategic decision to have this conversation, and is presenting the having of it as casual. "Do you have a moment?" he said. She closed the book she was reading. "Come in," she said. He sat down in the chair across from hers. The fire was going. The afternoon light was coming through the windows at the long late afternoon angle that April produced up here, golden and slightly slanted, making the library look like a different room than its winter self. He looked at her directly. She appreciated that at least. "The Den Morrow arrangement," he said, "is in the consultation period," she said. "I know. I've read the outline." He paused. "It's a better solution than anything the mediation process produced in 7 years." She waited. "I'm going to support it in council," he said, formally, "when it comes to vote." She looked at him. He held her gaze without difficulty, which told her he had made this decision fully, and was not performing it. "Why?" she said. "Because it addresses the actual problem," he said, "which is what I have always said needed to happen. I used the political dimension of the problem as a lever, because I needed leverage, but the problem itself is real, and this arrangement addresses it." He paused again. "And because supporting it publicly is better for the Eastern District seat I now hold than opposing it would be." There was the second reason, stated plainly. She respected the plainness. "I'll note that," she said. "I'm not withdrawing from the council," he said. "I'm not stopping what I'm doing. I didn't expect you to. I'm saying I'll support this one thing cleanly," he said, "without political condition." She thought about him for a moment. About the 8 council sessions she had watched him in, about the smile that meant something when it benefited him, and the careful positioning that had never been personal in any way she had detected, about the procedural amendment, and the trade file request, and the spring election. He was ambitious, and he was calculating, and he was not, she had come to understand, entirely wrong in what he wanted. His judgment about the trade agreements was not entirely wrong. His judgment about the pace at which the territory needed to reform was not entirely wrong. He was wrong in his methods often, and he had tried to use her as a lever, which she had found cold, but the position he was advancing was not without basis. "The Eastern Border Trade revision," she said, "not the full reform you proposed. A partial revision of the most problematic clauses." He was quiet. "I have been reading the trade files," she said. "I have been reading them since January. There are 4 clauses in the current agreements that are genuinely working against the border pacts. Not all 18 that you identified. 4. He looked at her. "Bring those 4, she said, "to Aldrich's committee, as a separate motion from your original proposal. Aldrich will examine them on their merits, and he will not have any particular reason to obstruct them." "Why are you giving me this?" Vane said. She considered the question honestly. "Because the 4 clauses are a real problem," she said, "and because if I leave you with nothing, you'll find something else to use as a lever. If I give you a legitimate path for the part of your agenda that actually has merit, you have less reason to look for the other kind." He was very still. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since January," she said. He looked at the fire for a moment. "All right," he said. He left. She sat in the library for a while and thought about the shape of the conversation. Not satisfaction exactly. Something more precise. The feeling that a process had been moved from friction to working order, which was not the same as resolving it. Vane would continue to be Vane. The spring election would not be the last election. The council would remain a complicated room full of complicated people with real interests that did not always align. But she had given him the 4 clauses, and he had taken them, and the Den Morrow arrangement would go forward, and the reviews she had started were embedded now in the committee structure in ways that would continue whether or not she was watching them specifically. That was how things got done, not with a single decision or a single meeting, but with the slow accumulation of smaller ones, each one doing the small real work it was able to do. She understood this. She had always understood it. It was how a seamstress worked, the hem before the waist, the lining before the outer fabric, the final pressing only after everything else was right. That evening, after supper, Callum came to the East Corridor. She was there first. She had gone there without particular reason. The same habit of the evening walk, the same quiet at this hour, the same bench in the alcove. She was sitting with her back against the wall and her feet on the cold stone and the single candle in the wall niche making its small moving light. He came around the corner and found her. He sat down beside her, not by coincidence. She understood that he had come looking for her specifically, and this was where she was. "Vane came to find me," she said. "I know," he said. "He told me. He told you. He said you'd had a conversation, and that he was going to support the Den Morrow arrangement, Callum said. He didn't tell me anything else about it. She thought about that. Vane had chosen what to pass on, and what not to. She was not sure what to make of that exactly, but it was another data point. They were quiet. The corridor was what it always was at this hour. Dim, still, the stones slightly warmer than the outside air, the distant sounds of the palace settling into its nighttime self. In summer, she thought, this corridor would probably be different, lighter through the end of the day, but she had come to know it in winter, and in the shoulder season of late winter turning to spring, and she knew its character. Callum reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He held out a coin. Old, northern minted, the kind that had not been in circulation for decades. She knew this because she had read the currency history of the territory, which was perhaps an unusual thing to have read but had seemed relevant to the economic files, and had turned out to be interesting in its own right. The coin was worn smooth at the edges the way old coins wore, and the face on it was the face of a king she did not recognize from 200 years ago, barely legible. She looked at it. I have been carrying this since October, he said. She looked at him. Since the 3rd week of October, he said. Since I understood that I was going to give it to you at some point and I did not know when the right time was. She had not looked away from his face. She was looking at him with the same attention she gave to difficult problems, not the attention that performed itself, but the kind that was simply fully there. October was the month I arrived, she said. Yes. You'd known me 2 weeks. 3, he said. I knew you for a week before we arrived. She looked at the coin in his hand. The candlelight moved across it. What does it mean? She said. Not the coin, that was obvious. What does giving it mean? What are you saying with it? It means, he said, carefully, in the way he was careful when he was being exact, that from the beginning I was certain about what I was doing, and that in the 3 months since October, I have become certain about more. She sat with that. You're not certain about everything, she said. No, he said, there are things I don't know yet. About us. About what this is. But you're certain about the direction. Yes, he said. She looked at the coin again, old, smooth, worn by 200 years of hands. She thought about October, the arrival at the palace, the first council session, the East Corridor bench the first time, the library, the walk with Sarah in the South Garden, the snow and the kitchen garden and Nat in the dark, the trade files and the review and the 4-3 vote, Elder Crane at the Morrow gate saying not what I was expecting. 8 months of work and learning and doing the next thing and the next. She thought about a road in Eldon Hollow and a man on a wall in the cold and a coin she could not afford and the math saying no and her going anyway. He had been going anyway too. She took the coin. It was small and warm from his coat pocket, and she held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, which was greater than a coin of that size usually weighed, which was the kind of thing that happened when something carried more than its material. Her hand stayed where it was. His hand stayed where it was. They did not immediately move, and neither of them spoke, and the corridor was quiet, and the single candle made its small patient light, and the palace breathed around them. I have not done this before, she said. Not the coin, not this evening. This, whatever this is, the whole version of it. Nor have I, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with no performance in it at all, nothing managed, just the real expression of a real person, tired and certain and present. You were the one who went past the math, she said. We both did, he said. She held the coin. She thought, I am going to figure this out the way I figure out everything, which is by being inside it long enough to understand its shape. Tell me what you want, she said. Not what the court needs, not what the formal process requires, the actual thing. He was quiet for a long time, not avoiding the question, taking it seriously in the way he took serious things. I want someone, he said, who will come around the corner into the room where the problem is and sit down in the observer's chair and not let the room manage her. He paused. I want someone who reads the border files for 4 days and finds the map discrepancy and then gives it away without signing her name to it because she knows that's how it has to be done. I want someone who walks into a review with no bloodline and makes the argument that changes the definition of what the argument was about. He stopped. I want you, he said, plainly. She sat with that. Outside the palace, the spring evening was cold and smelled of the earth beginning to change, the specific smell of ground that has been frozen for months, slowly releasing its cold, and remembering that it had other qualities. Through the end of the corridor, she could feel that air. Yes, she said. Not ceremony, not formal answer, Just the word, the same way she had said it in the inn at Eldon Hollow, the same direct and honest yes that she gave when she meant it and did not give when she didn't. His hand moved, covered hers, briefly, the coin between them. He did not make it more than it was, neither did she. They stayed in the corridor for another while and the candle burned and the palace settled and it was enough. The way enough things are if you let them be what they are. She went to bed that night holding the coin loosely, not tightly, just feeling its weight. She slept deeply and woke before 5 and went to the window, and the kitchen garden below was showing the first real color of spring, small green things along the wall, new shoots coming through the softened soil, and along the south wall, in the early morning dark, the roses were beginning. She looked at them for a long time. Nat appeared at the gate with his flat board and his quiet purpose, and he moved along the beds, and the light came up slowly over the hill, and the pines on the ridge held their dark weight, and the new light found the places between them and the day began. She kept the coin in the pocket of her good wool dress. She wore it every day after that. The coronation was set for the 15th of June. Not because the 15th of June had particular ceremony behind it, but because by the 15th of June the Den Moro arrangement would have been in consultation for 8 months, and could proceed to formal signing, and the spring territorial roads would be fully open, and the pack elders from all 5 territories could make the journey to the palace without the winter roads being any part of the conversation. Callum had made this decision in May. Mara had agreed with it, not because she needed the arrangement to be resolved before she felt ready, but because resolving the arrangement before the coronation meant that the first formal act she presided over would be the signing, which was the kind of beginning she wanted. She wrote to her mother in late May with the date. She did not write, "Come if you can." She wrote, "I need you to be here. There is a difference," and she had earned the right to say the direct version, and her mother deserved to hear it. Her mother came. Adela Weston arrived at the palace on the 11th of June on a coach arranged by the court, in the company of Clara and Clara's husband and the baby, who was 4 months old and had a specific opinion about long coach journeys that she expressed without restraint. Mara was in the courtyard when the coach pulled in and she watched her mother descend the steps, careful, taking the outrider's offered hand, straightening her coat when she reached the ground, and she felt something move in her chest with the particular quiet force of things that have been waiting a long time. Adela Weston looked at the palace, she looked at the courtyard, she looked at Fiona, who was standing to the side with the particular readiness of someone prepared to be helpful. She looked at her daughter. She did not say anything immediately. She crossed the courtyard and she put her arms around Mara, and Mara put her arms around her mother, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. "It's very big," her mother said, finally, into Mara's shoulder. "I know," Mara said. "I got lost for the first week." Her mother pulled back and looked at her face, the way mothers look at faces, taking stock, checking for the real thing underneath the surface thing. Whatever she found, she seemed to find it satisfactory, because her expression settled. "You look like yourself," her mother said. "I am myself," Mara said. "More than I was." Clara appeared from behind with the baby on her arm and the particular glow of a person who has been traveling all day and is genuinely delighted to have arrived regardless. She handed the baby to Mara without preamble, which was the Clara way of doing things. The baby looked at Mara with the serious expression that very young things had when they were processing new information. "She knows you," Clara said. "I've talked about you." "She has no idea who I am," Mara said. "She will," Clara said. Fiona took charge of the arrivals and got everyone sorted into rooms and settled, and Mara spent the evening with her mother and Clara and the baby in the sitting room with the window that looked over the kitchen garden. The roses were fully open by now, deep red, the kind that gave off a smell you could notice from inside if the evening was warm and the window was cracked, which it was. They talked for 3 hours and drank the tea that Fiona brought, and Mara's mother held the baby, and the evening light went gold, and then blue, and then dark. Her mother asked about the palace and the people, and the council, and the work. She did not ask about Callum directly, which was strategic, because she wanted to see what Mara would say unprompted. And what Mara said unprompted was, "He is the most honest person I have found in a room that requires a lot of dishonesty, and he reads border files in the evenings, and he agrees to wait when I ask him to wait." She said this without ceremony, and her mother listened, and did not make her expression do anything that required comment. "What you said in your letter," her mother said, "about the man on the road, he was disguised. He tests every claiming feast," Mara said, "looking for someone who responds to the actual person rather than the position." Her mother was quiet. "And you gave him your last coin," she said. "I did the math," Mara said. "The math said no." And you went anyway, her mother said. Mara looked at her. Her mother was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. Too many things in it, some of them old, some of them new. Her mother had gone anyway her whole life too, in smaller and harder circumstances, and had not always had it land the way it landed on that road. Mara understood this, and did not make it smaller or larger than it was. You taught me that, Mara said. Her mother said nothing. She looked at the baby in her arms, who had fallen asleep with the complete commitment of very young things to whatever they were currently doing. I did, her mother said after a moment, quietly, as if she was checking whether it was true and finding that it was. The morning of the 15th arrived with the particular brightness of a day that knows it has been planned for. The palace was full. Representatives from all 5 territories had arrived over the previous 3 days. The territorial lords and their partners, the pack elders, Crane and Voss both, which was the first time they had been in the same building since the personal history between them had made that complicated, and which had required a conversation with Sarah that Mara had been present for, and which had resolved in a way she had not fully anticipated. Sarah, in the end, had told both of them the same thing she had once said to Mara, that she would try not to confuse her personal and procedural objections. It had been sufficient. Aldrich was present in the formal robes he never wore unless required. Lord Edmund Vane was present in his council seat, and he looked at Mara when she entered the main hall with the expression of a man who had made a strategic accommodation, and was living with it, and was not entirely comfortable with it, and was also not willing to not attend, because not attending would have said something he was not prepared to say. She nodded at him. He nodded back. Fiona had laid out Mara's formal dress the night before. It was hers, made for her by the palace seamstress over 2 months of careful fittings, in the dark green she always wore, cut with the precision of something designed for the person rather than the position. She had specified this. She was not wearing borrowed fabric to her own coronation. She dressed herself, with Fiona present in the room but not helping unless asked, which was how she always dressed on days that mattered. She looked at herself in the mirror once, briefly. The mirror gave her back a woman in dark green with her hair pinned back and the old northern coin in the pocket of her dress. All right, she said, to herself rather than to Fiona. All right, Fiona said, in agreement. The formal ceremony was held in the main hall. The old hall, the one in the central building that was the oldest part of the palace, with the vaulted ceiling she had looked at on her first day and allowed herself 1 second to look at before she looked straight ahead. The whole hall was full. She had not seen it full before, only in portions and sections, and full was a different thing. The sound was different, the air was different. It had the quality of occasions that only happened once in a generation, and the people in it knew this and were carrying themselves accordingly. Callum stood at the front of the hall. He was wearing formal northern dress, which she had only seen on him once before, at a territorial reception in April, and which did not change him but placed him precisely in what he was. Not the man in dark wool, not the man on the east corridor bench, but the full version of him that held both of those things inside it. She walked to him through the hall. The walk was not long, but it felt very exact. Every footstep on stone she had been walking on for 9 months, and she knew this floor now the way you knew a place you had decided to stay in. Elder Harwick's northern equivalent, a woman named Pell, who was 84, and had been the keeper of northern rites for longer than anyone could clearly remember, stood between them with the formal elements of the ceremony laid out. The Queen's Mark, which was a band of dark metal worked in the northern style, the territorial seal, the formal oath. Pell looked at Mara with very old eyes that had seen a great deal and were not particularly impressed by ceremony but were fully present in it. "Are you here freely?" Pell said. "I am here freely," Mara said. "Are you here completely?" "I am here completely." "Are you here as yourself?" "As myself," Mara said, "no other." Pell nodded once. She took the Queen's Mark. She moved to give it to Callum, which was the ceremony. The Alpha King placed the mark, which meant the partner was received by the pack through him. Callum took it. He looked at Mara and she looked at him, and for a moment it was just the two of them in the way of moments that contained all the private history and did not need any of it spoken, the East Corridor and the library and the border files and the coin and the road and the wall and the beginning of everything. He placed the mark. It was cool against her skin, then not. Pell said the words. The hall received them. Callum said his part. She said hers. The formal seal was applied to the formal documents. Pell made the announcement in the old voice that 8 decades of ceremony had given her, and the hall responded in the traditional way, which was not applause but the deep sound of a room of people making the noise of acknowledgement, old and wordless and surprisingly moving. She was the Northern Queen. It did not feel the way she had expected it to feel. She had not expected ceremony, and the ceremony was less than the reality of it. The reality was 9 months of learning and work and conflict and resolution, and 2 people sitting in a corridor in the dark and a coin in a pocket, and her mother's face in the courtyard. The reality had already happened. This was the room acknowledging it. She was all right with that. She thought rooms acknowledging things were underrated. It was good to be seen. After the formal proceedings, the hall moved into the gathering that followed, which was elaborate and warm, and not her favorite part of things, but was genuinely celebratory in a way she had not fully expected. Pack members from the outer territories who had come for the occasion, and who she had not yet met, found her in the crowd and introduced themselves, and she made note of their names and where they were from and what their faces looked like when they talked about the places they came from, which was always when you got the real version. She found Crane in the crowd. Crane looked at her and gave the territorial acknowledgement, the single formal nod, and then, unexpectedly, added something to it, a slight extension of the gesture, a second beat that meant something more. Mara did not know the old formal language well enough to be certain of the meaning, but the sense of it was, I see what you have done and I am adding my name to it. She held that. Voss was across the room. He caught her eye and raised his cup briefly. She raised hers. Lord Aldrich was near the far window with a cup of something he was not drinking, and the expression of a man who had outlasted another significant event, and was noting this with satisfaction. He looked at her when she approached. You've been on that council for 30 years, she said. 32, he said. You've seen how many of these? 4 coronations, he said. 2 before I was old enough to count and 2 after. What did you think of this one? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Aldrich taking his time was Aldrich being precise. The speech you gave, he said. In the review session, the bloodline presentation. Yes, I have been on this council for 32 years, he said. I have heard many presentations in that chamber. I have never heard one that started by saying exactly what it did not have, and then made that into the argument. She looked at him. That was the right way to do it, he said. It came out with the flatness of someone saying a thing that was simply true, and saw no reason to decorate it. Thank you, she said. He made the compressed sound that might have been a laugh, the same one from the corridor months ago. He went back to not drinking his cup. Sarah found her near the end of the gathering. Mara had been waiting for this, not with dread, with the particular alertness she always had around Sarah, the one that was not quite caution and not quite admiration, but something that contained elements of both. Sarah was in her finest council dress, impeccable, and her face was what it always was, composed, present, slightly withheld. They stood near the tall windows at the back of the hall where the last of the afternoon light was coming through, making long rectangles on the stone floor. I voted for you, Sarah said. I know, Mara said. I want you to understand why. I think I do, Mara said. But tell me. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Whatever internal process this was, she gave it the time it required. I have spent 11 years building the structure of this territory's council, she said. The architecture of how decisions are made. I built it because I believe that the quality of a territory's governance depends entirely on the quality of its decision-making, and that requires people who understand what is actually at stake rather than what appears to be at stake. She paused. You found the map discrepancy in 4 days, she said. I found it in 8 months and had been managing the politics of how to introduce it for 6. You introduced it in the review, in a way that made the political conversation around it irrelevant. You gave the information away without signing your name to it, because you understood that was how it needed to be done in that moment. You noticed that, Mara said. I notice everything, Sarah said. It is my job. I know, Mara said. I noticed that you noticed. Sarah looked at her. The expression was unreadable by most standards, but Mara had been reading Sarah's expressions for 9 months, and she recognized what was underneath this one. The real thing, without management. I voted for you, Sarah said, because you are good at the actual work, not the performance of it, the work. Thank you, Mara said. That is the right reason. I will continue to object to things you do, Sarah said. I know. Some of those objections will be correct. I know that too, Mara said. I'm counting on it. Something moved in Sarah's face, very small, not warm exactly, but the territory adjacent to warm. The place that existed between 2 people who had decided they were working in the same direction, even when they were arguing about the road. Good, Sarah said. She left. Mara stood at the window and watched the long light on the stone floor and let the hall carry on around her. Callum appeared at her shoulder. Your mother is looking for you, he said. Where? Near the food, he said. She found Nat. Mara almost smiled. Nat had been given a formal role in the gathering preparations, and was managing it with the same quiet efficiency he brought to the kitchen garden, and she was genuinely unsurprised that her mother had found him. Her mother had always had a natural gravity toward people who did the actual work without needing it remarked upon. She went to find her mother. Adela Weston was standing near the table with Nat and a cup of something warm, and they were talking about the kitchen garden with the ease of two people who both knew what they were talking about. Her mother looked up when Mara arrived, and the expression on her face was the complicated one Mara had seen in the courtyard. Too many things in it, the old ones and the new ones, and also something else, something that was only starting to be there. Mara recognized it. She had felt it herself, in varying forms over the last 9 months. It was the expression of someone whose story was changing shape in the retelling, whose ending was landing different than the years had said it would. Her mother reached out and touched Mara's arm, just for a moment, just to confirm the real. The roses are open, Nat said, looking toward the garden windows. All three of them looked. Through the hall windows, across the courtyard, along the kitchen garden wall, the roses were fully open in the evening light, the deep red of them vivid against the old stone, the smell of them just reaching through the palace walls to where they stood. Nat said they come all at once up here, Mara said. They do, he said. The cold holds them back, and then they come. Her mother looked at the roses for a long time. But later, much later, when the gathering had wound down and the hall was quieter and the territorial visitors had gone to their rooms, Mara and Callum walked the east corridor one more time. Their corridor. It was that now, and had been for a while, though she was only now naming it directly. She had the coin in her pocket. She moved it between her fingers as they walked, the smooth, worn edges, the weight of it, 200 years of hands. What did your mother say? He said. She said I look like myself. You do, he said. She also asked me to tell her what he was like, Mara said. The man I had described in the letters, the one on the road. What did you tell her? I told her he was honest, Mara said, and that he read border files in the evenings, and that when I ask him to wait, he waits. He was quiet for a beat. That's an accurate description, he said. I know, she said. I was there. They reached the bench in the alcove. They sat down. The palace was settling around them into the sounds of late evening, quiet, familiar, the language of a building she knew. She looked at the wall. The stone was the same stone it had always been, gray, old, wearing its years evenly. She thought about the road in Eldon Hollow, the fog, the borrowed dress and the white flowers, the coin in her palm and the arithmetic that said no, and the moment she went anyway, which was not a moment of courage exactly, but a moment of being entirely herself, which was the only kind of courage that had ever actually worked for her. She thought about her mother's 20 years, and the 5 years before that, and the entry in the passing over column, and all the things that had not resolved the way they were supposed to, and the way a story changed shape in the retelling, and how the ending that had landed here was not the ending the years had promised. She thought about Callum beside her on the bench, steady and present and tired and real. She thought about the coin. It had started this. A coin she could not afford, given to a man she did not know, on a road to a night she had not expected to matter. She had done the math. The math had said no. She had gone anyway. She had always gone anyway. Her whole life, every time the math said no, every time the room did not expect her, every time the bloodline column was empty and the borrowed dress did not quite fit, and the list had her near the end and the odds were what they were, she had looked at the numbers and then passed the numbers at the actual thing, the real thing, the human thing that was always there waiting for someone to respond to it, and she had responded. That was what she was. That was what she had always been. The seamstress's daughter. The one at the edge of the list. The one who did the math and went anyway. The coin was warm from her pocket and worn smooth from 200 years of hands, and she held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, and outside the corridor window the June night was warm and smelled of roses, and somewhere in the palace her mother was sleeping in a room with a proper bed, in a place that her daughter had built out of 1 copper coin, and 23 years of going past the math. She looked at the stone wall. She was home. She had been heading here her whole life without knowing it. She closed her hand around the coin and held it, and the palace breathed around her, and she was here, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was hers.